Tonight we are going to talk about the most dangerous traitor in the history of Middle-earth, and I do not mean Sauron. Sauron was always the enemy. Everybody knew what Sauron was. The being I am talking about was trusted by the gods themselves, chosen to lead the most important mission in the history of the world, given the highest rank and the deepest knowledge and the keys to an indestructible fortress, and he used every single one of those gifts to betray the people who gave them to him. Not quickly. Not in a single dramatic moment of turning. Slowly over 2,000 years. Decision by careful, brilliant, perfectly rationalized decision, until the being who was sent to save the world had become the thing the world needed saving from. Tonight we tell the story of Saruman, not the villain you already know from the movies. Not the old man in the tower with the army and the voice. The story of who he was before all of that. What he was doing in the centuries before anyone suspected. And exactly how the most intelligent being walking the earth talked himself into becoming the very evil he was sent to destroy. There is a scene in the Two Towers that should terrify you more than any Balrog, more than the Nazgul at Weathertop, more than the eye itself pressing down on Frodo's mind on Amon Hen. It is not a battle scene. It is Saruman standing at the top of Orthanc, speaking, just speaking. That is all he does. He opens his mouth and words come out, and every warrior standing in the wreckage of his own fortress men, who have just fought and bled and watched friends die, because of this wizard's treachery, every one of them begins to feel that maybe they were wrong. That maybe the wizard has a point. That maybe the reasonable thing to do is to listen, to negotiate, to put down the sword and walk away. Gandalf breaks the spell. Gandalf shatters the staff. And the moment passes. But if you sit with that scene, if you really think about what just happened, it should disturb you more than dragons. Because what you just witnessed is the most dangerous kind of evil in Tolkien's entire mythology. Not the evil that comes at you with fire and steel. The evil that comes at you with a reasonable voice and a good argument, and makes you feel that the wrong thing is the sensible thing, and that you came to that conclusion on your own. That is Saruman. That is what he became. The being who could make a lie feel like your own best thinking. But here is what nobody asks. How did he get there? How did the being who was chosen by the gods themselves as the leader of the most important mission in the history of the world, chosen because he was the most brilliant, the most capable, the most trusted, how did that being become the one who bred monsters in pits and poisoned kings through whispered counsel and tried to seize the weapon of the enemy for himself? The answer is not simple. It is not the answer you expect. It is not he was always secretly evil, or the Palantir corrupted him, or power corrupts. Those answers are too easy for what actually happened. What actually happened is worse. What actually happened is that Saruman fell because of the very qualities that made him great. Fell because the intelligence that should have saved the world was the exact kind of intelligence that could not resist the temptation the world presented. Fell because the Valar, in choosing their champion, chose a being whose greatest strength was indistinguishable from his greatest vulnerability, and nobody, not even the Valar, saw it in time. The story of who Saruman was, what he was sent to do, and exactly how year by year, century by century, decision by careful decision, the greatest mind in Middle-earth talked itself into becoming the thing it was sent to destroy. This one cuts deep. Stay with me. Part 1. The Maya of Ol's Forge. Before there was Saruman, before there was even a body to call by that name, there was a spirit called Kurumo. He existed before the world was made. He was among the Ainur, the divine intelligences, who sang the world into its first shape under the direction of Ilúvatar, the One, the god behind all gods. Kurumo was a Maya, not one of the great Valar who shaped the mountains and lit the stars. A lesser spirit powerful, but in the way that a river is powerful compared to the ocean. Enormous by any mortal reckoning. small by divine standards. And Kurumo belonged to all. This matters more than almost anything else in his story, and I need you to understand why. Because Owl was not just any valor. Owl was the smith, the maker. The divine intelligence whose specific domain was the substance of the world, the stone and the metal, and the deep structures of the earth. Owl understood how things were built, how they worked, how the raw materials of creation could be shaped into things of purpose and beauty. The Maiar who served Owl inherited this orientation. They were makers, craftsmen, beings whose fundamental relationship to the world was the relationship of the artisan to the material. I understand what this is, and I can see what it could become. Kurumo was among the most gifted of Owl's people. His specific gift was not simply making, but understanding. Not just the ability to forge a thing, but the ability to comprehend the system behind the forging, the principles, the structures, the deep rules that governed why one approach worked and another did not. He could look at a complex arrangement and see its architecture, could identify the leverage points, could understand with a clarity that exceeded most of his peers how the pieces fit together and how changing one piece would affect all the others. This is what we would call systems intelligence, the ability to think in interconnected wholes rather than isolated parts. The ability to see not just the tree but the forest, not just the forest but the ecology, not just the ecology but the relationship between the ecology and the geography and the climate and every other system that connects to it. It is an extraordinarily valuable form of intelligence. And it is the form of intelligence that, when corrupted, produces the most comprehensive and most invisible kind of evil. But I am getting ahead of myself. There is another Maiar who served in Owl's household, a spirit who shared Kurumo's maker orientation, who shared his gift for understanding systems, who shared the specific quality of intelligence that comprehends how things work and wants to improve them. That spirit's name was Myron. Myron became Sauron. Sit with that for a moment. The two most dangerous beings in the Third Age of Middle-earth, the Dark Lord and the White Wizard who would try to replace him, came from the same divine household. They were, in a sense, brothers in the craft. Brothers in the mode of thought that starts with I understand how this works, and that, in both of them, eventually progressed to I will make it work the way I decide. Mairon fell first. Fell in Valinor, under Morgoth's direct influence, seduced by the promise of ordered creation on a grand scale, the promise that the Maker's desire to build could be fulfilled without the constraints of other wills, other preferences, other beings' annoying insistence on freedom. Morgoth offered Mairon a world that worked the way Mairon thought it should work. Mairon accepted. And the greatest servant of the Dark Lord was born. Kurumo did not fall in Valinor. That is important. He was not Sauron's ally. He was not secretly evil. He watched his fellow spirit fall, and he stayed. He remained in Owl's service. He remained loyal. But the seed was there. The same fundamental orientation that had made Mairon vulnerable to Morgoth's offer was present in Kurumo. The same maker's desire, the same system thinker's hunger to organize, the same craftsman's itch to improve what he saw as flawed. The seed would take much, much longer to germinate in Kurumo than it had in Mairon. Thousands of years longer. But it would germinate. And when it did, it would produce not a Dark Lord, but something in some ways more insidious, a White Wizard, who believed, with the full force of the most sophisticated analytical intelligence in the world, that his corruption was wisdom. Part 2. The choosing. Around the year 1000 of the Third Age, the Valar faced a problem. Sauron was returning. Not openly, not yet, with the armies and the fire and the eye. Quietly, in the shadows of Mirkwood, in the whispers that reached the eastern peoples, in the slow accumulation of dread, that the wise could feel like a change in atmospheric pressure. Something was rebuilding in Middle-earth, something that carried the specific signature of the old evil. The Valar debated what to do. They had intervened directly once before, in the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, and the intervention had been catastrophic in its collateral damage. Beleriand drowned, the geography of the world permanently altered, untold thousands dead in the destruction that divine warfare visits on mortal lands. They would not repeat that mistake. Instead, they would send emissaries, Maya powerful spirits, but clothed in mortal bodies, limited in their abilities, constrained to work through persuasion and counsel rather than divine force. These emissaries would walk among the free peoples of Middle-earth as old men. They would advise, they would inspire, they would help coordinate the resistance against whatever Sauron was becoming. They would not rule. 5 were chosen, 5 spirits drawn from different divine households, each bringing different gifts to the mission. Kurumo was chosen to lead. The choice made perfect sense. Kurumo was the most knowledgeable of the candidates. He understood Sauron's nature both being products of All's household. Kurumo understood the Maker's psychology that drove Sauron's ambition. He was the most analytically capable, the best organizer, the spirit most suited to the specific task of coordinating a multi-kingdom resistance across the vast and politically fractured landscape of Middle-earth. Manwë, the Elder King, supported the choice. Kurumo would be the White Wizard, the head of the Order, the chief of the Astari. But something happened during the choosing that planted the second seed, the seed that would grow alongside the Maker's seed into the tangled roots of Saruman's corruption. Another Maya was chosen for the mission, a spirit named Olrin, who served Man and Varda, who walked among the elves of Valinor unseen, who was known for his compassion, his gentleness, his specific quality of understanding not how systems work, but how people suffer. Olrin did not want to go. He told the Valar he was too weak for the task. He was afraid of Sauron. Manwë said, "That is exactly why you should go." This exchange contains the entire future of the Astari mission in miniature. The spirit who was afraid of the enemy was told that his fear was an asset. The spirit who doubted his own capability was identified by the chief of the Valar as uniquely suited for a mission that required the specific quality of humility that self-doubt produces. Olrin became Gandalf, and Kurumo was watching. Kurumo, who was confident. Kurumo, who was not afraid. Kurumo, who had been chosen to lead precisely because of the qualities that Gandalf lacked: the analytical brilliance, the organizational capability, the authoritative certainty. Kurumo watched the exchange and understood something that would eat at him for 2,000 years. The Valar trusted Gandalf's weakness more than they trusted Saruman's strength. Galadriel would later make this preference explicit. When the White Council was formed, Galadriel wanted Gandalf to lead it, not Saruman. Gandalf the reluctant, the humble, the afraid. Galadriel, who had been born in Valinor, who had seen the two trees, who was older and wiser than any elf in Middle-earth, looked at the two leading wizards and chose Gandalf. Saruman was given the position, but the preference was known, and the knowing was a wound that never healed. Part 3. Arrival and the Eastern Journey. The Astari arrived in Middle-earth around the year 1000 of the Third Age. They came by ship to the Grey Havens, where Credan the Shipwright, the oldest and wisest of the elves remaining in Middle-earth, received them. And Credan did something extraordinary. He gave his ring Narya, the Ring of Fire, one of the 3 elven rings, not to Saruman, the leader of the Order, but to Gandalf. Círdan looked at the 2 wizards and saw what Galadriel had seen, that Gandalf was the one who would need the ring's power most, because Gandalf was the one who would do the most with it. Not because Gandalf was more powerful, because Gandalf was more likely to use power rightly. If Saruman knew about this at the time, and Tolkien suggests he may have learnt of it later, the wound deepened. The leader of the Order passed over for a gift by the very people he had been sent to help. The pattern establishing itself, Saruman in the position of authority, Gandalf in the position of trust. The title belonging to one wizard, and the confidence of the wise belonging to the other. Saruman went east. This decision to travel into the eastern regions of Middle-earth, into the territories where Sauron's influence was strongest, is one of the most important and most mysterious decisions in Saruman's early career. The east was Sauron's domain, not Mordor. Not yet Mordor was still silent, still recovering from the last alliance. The east was the broad swath of territory beyond Mirkwood, beyond the Sea of Ren, where the peoples that Sauron had been working on since the Second Age lived under the residual influence of his long cultivation. The Easterlings, the peoples of Khand and Ren. The cultures that Sauron had shaped through centuries of religious and political manipulation into something that served his purposes. Saruman travelled through these lands. He studied them. He observed how Sauron's influence operated on the ground level, not the dramatic evil of fire and shadow, but the practical, day-to-day mechanisms through which a dark power maintains control over vast populations. The priest networks, the warlord hierarchies, the trade systems that channeled resources towards Sauron's purposes, the religious structures that positioned Sauron as a divine authority. What Saruman saw in the east was a system, a comprehensive, interconnected, well-designed system of control that spanned an enormous territory and operated with a degree of coordination that the free peoples of the West could not match. For the system thinker, for the Maya whose fundamental mode of intelligence was the comprehension of how systems work, this observation was formative. Saruman looked at Sauron's Eastern Empire and saw what the Free People's Alliance lacked: organization. Structure, the specific quality of centralized coordination that allows diverse elements to operate toward a unified purpose. The Free Peoples had no such coordination. They had independent kingdoms with independent policies and independent suspicions of each other, and independent unwillingness to subordinate their autonomy to any shared command structure. They had freedom. And freedom, to the system thinker's analytical eye, looked like chaos. The observation was not wrong. The Free Peoples were disorganized. The Free Peoples would spend the entire Third Age struggling to coordinate a response to Sauron, and the difficulty of that coordination would cost them dearly. Gandalf's entire career would be defined by the effort to get the Free Peoples to cooperate, and the effort would never fully succeed until the crisis was already upon them. Saruman saw the problem clearly. He was the first to diagnose it correctly, and the diagnosis, the specific, accurate, analytically rigorous diagnosis of the Free People's greatest weakness, was the foundation on which every subsequent wrong conclusion would be built. Because the system thinker looked at the problem and saw a systems solution, what the Free Peoples need is organization. What they need is coordination. What they need is a central authority that can align their diverse capabilities toward a common purpose. What the system thinker did not see, could not see, given the mode of intelligence doing the seeing, was that the Free People's chaos was not a design flaw. It was the design. The freedom that looked like disorganization was the specific quality that made the Free Peoples worth saving. And any solution that eliminated the freedom in order to produce the organization would destroy the thing it was trying to protect. Saruman came back from the east with the diagnosis that would drive his entire career. The Free Peoples need to be organized. What he would spend 2,000 years discovering too late was that the organizing would make him the enemy. Part 3b, Isengard before the corruption. Before the corruption, Isengard was beautiful. This is a detail that gets lost in the version of Isengard that most people carry in their minds, the version from the films, the version of fire and smoke and pits, the hellish industrial landscape that Merry and Pippin saw from the Ents' shoulders. That version is real. But it is the endpoint. Before the endpoint, there was a beginning, and the beginning was beautiful. Tolkien describes the Valley of Isengard as it was, enclosed by the Ring of Isengard, the great natural wall of rock that circled the valley like a stone amphitheatre. There were gardens, orchards, running water, trees that had been planted and tended across centuries by the Gondorian caretakers who maintained the fortress. The Tower of Orthanc rose from the centre of this valley black, ancient, indestructible, but the valley around it was green. When Saruman was given the keys, he was given stewardship of a living place, a place where the relationship between the made thing the Dao and the living thing the Larn was in balance. The fortress served the land, and the land sustained the fortress. The Gondorians who had maintained Isengard understood this relationship. They were descendants of the Inmemorians, who had learned from the Elves, who had learned from the Valar, that the proper relationship between the Maker and the world is the relationship of the steward who tends what is there rather than the master who replaces it. Saruman inherited this relationship. For decades, perhaps for centuries, he maintained it. The gardens continued. The trees grew. The water ran. The Valley of Isengard remained, under Saruman's stewardship, the specific kind of place where beauty and function coexisted. The change was gradual, not a decision adrift. The specific, incremental, almost imperceptible drift of attention from one priority to another. The gardens required attention. The strategic planning required attention. The ring law studies required attention. The council management required attention. And attention, for any being, even a Maya, is finite. The gardens lost the competition for attention. Not because Saruman decided to neglect them. Because the other demands on his attention were more urgent, more interesting, more aligned with the qualities he valued in himself. The gardens were simple. The strategy was complex. The gardens required patience. The analysis required intensity. The gardens were about maintaining what was there. The analysis was about creating what should be. The drift was the corruption's first physical expression. The gardens died not from active destruction, but from passive neglect, the specific quality of a caretaker who has stopped caring about the specific things his care was supposed to sustain. By the time Saruman began actively destroying the valley, digging the pits, building the forges, converting the garden into a factory, the gardens were already mostly dead. The active destruction was the completion of a process that had started much earlier, with the specific quality of inattention that is the system thinker's characteristic failing. The inability to maintain attention on things that are not part of the system thinker is building. Gardens are not part of any system. Gardens are the opposite of systems. Gardens are relationships with living things that grow at their own pace, in their own direction, according to their own nature. You cannot systematize a garden. You can only tend it. And tending the patient, daily, undramatic act of paying attention to what is there and helping it grow is the specific kind of work that the system thinker's mode of intelligence cannot sustain. The death of Isengard's gardens is the first chapter of the scouring of the Shire. The same mode of intelligence that neglected Isengard's beauty would eventually destroy the Shire's beauty. The scale was different. The psychology was the same. Part 4. The Two Blue Wizards and the Fear of Irrelevance. 2 of the 5 Istari went east and never returned. Alatar and Palando, the Blue Wizards, vanished into the territories where Sauron's influence was strongest, and the Western histories never recorded their fate. Tolkien offered different accounts across his career. In some versions, the Blue Wizards failed, founding cults or losing themselves in the vastness of the East. In later accounts, he suggested they might have succeeded working against Sauron in the Eastern Territories, preventing his influence from becoming even more total than it already was. For our purposes, the Blue Wizard's disappearance matters because of what it meant for Saruman. 2 of the 5 are gone. The order is reduced from 5 to 3. And the reduction concentrates authority more heavily in the remaining members, especially in the head of the order. Fewer Astari means more importance for the Chief Astar. Fewer voices in the council means more weight for the loudest voice. Saruman benefited from this concentration. The Blue Wizard's absence made him more central, more necessary, more indispensable. The specific quality of being the leader that Saruman valued was enhanced by the reduction of the group he was leading. But the disappearance also planted a fear, a quiet, private, never-spoken fear that would grow alongside the resentment of Gandalf and the Maker's desire for the ring into the specific psychological cocktail that produced Saruman's corruption. The fear of irrelevance. The Blue Wizards were gone. Whether they failed or succeeded, they had done their work without Saruman. They had operated independently, in territories Saruman had visited but not controlled, pursuing their own strategies without reference to the head of the order. Their disappearance was proof that the Astari mission could operate without Saruman's coordination, that individual wizards working alone could accomplish things or fail to accomplish things without the system thinker's grand strategy. And Gandalf was doing the same thing. Gandalf did not wait for Saruman's direction. Gandalf wandered. Gandalf made his own assessments, pursued his own investigations, built his own relationships with the leaders of the Free Peoples. Gandalf was effective, increasingly effective, as the centuries passed, and his effectiveness was independent of Saruman's organizational framework. The fear crystallized. What if they don't need me? What if the mission can succeed without the system thinker's grand strategy? What if the wandering wizard, with his compassion and his hobbits and his stubborn insistence on the importance of small things, can do what the head of the order cannot? What if the quality that the Valar sent Saruman to provide, the analytical, organizational, systematic intelligence, is not what the mission actually needs? This fear is the personal dimension of the corruption that the theological and strategic dimensions alone do not capture. Saruman was not simply proud, he was afraid. Afraid that his excellence was unnecessary, that the specific quality of intelligence he brought to the mission, the system's intelligence, the analytical brilliance, the organizational capability, was less important than the quality Gandalf brought, the wisdom to understand people, to trust individuals, to work with the small and the personal rather than the grand and the systematic. If Gandalf was right, if the mission would ultimately be accomplished through the pity of a hobbit and the faithfulness of a gardener, rather than through the coordinated strategy of the wise, then Saruman's entire contribution was marginal. The head of the order was a figurehead. The white wizard was a white elephant. The fear of irrelevance does terrible things to intelligent people. It drives them to prove their relevance through action, increasingly dramatic, increasingly unilateral, increasingly disconnected from the shared purposes that the action is supposed to serve. The need to matter produces behavior designed to demonstrate that you matter, and the demonstration, over time, becomes the purpose. Saruman's search for the ring, his private, secret, unauthorized pursuit of the most powerful weapon in the world, was, at its psychological root, the response of a being who feared irrelevance, reaching for the one thing that would make him undeniably, permanently, irreversibly necessary. Part 5. The Settlement at Isengard. In the year 2759 of the Third Age, Saruman was given the keys to Orthanc, the fortress of Isengard, the Black Tower, standing in its ring of stone at the southern end of the Misty Mountains. Overlooking the Gap of Rohan had been built by the Dunedain in the days of their strength. The Tower of Orthanc was Menrian work, indestructible, impregnable. built with the specific craftsmanship that the men of Westeros brought from their island kingdom before the island sank. The steward of Gondor gave Saruman the keys because the arrangement served both parties. Gondor gained a powerful guardian for one of the most strategically significant positions in the West. Saruman gained a fortress. The strategic significance of Isengard cannot be overstated. The Gap of Rohan, the passage between the Misty Mountains and the White Mountains, was the primary east-west corridor through the western half of Middle-earth. Any army moving from the east toward Gondor or Rohan or the Shire would have to pass through or near the Gap. Isengard commanded the Gap. Whoever held Isengard held the key to the western defences. Saruman understood this with the specific clarity of the system thinker analysing a strategic map. He saw the Gap. He saw the fortress. He saw the relationship between position and power that every military intelligence has recognized since the first fortification was built. And he saw something else. He saw that Isengard was not simply a defensive position. It was a potential center of power. A place from which a sufficiently organized, sufficiently resourced, sufficiently capable leader could project influence across the entire western half of Middle-earth. The Valley of Isengard was beautiful when Saruman arrived. Tolkien describes it specifically. There were gardens and orchards within the ring of stone, trees growing, water flowing. The place had been maintained by its Gondorian caretakers as a living space, a place where beauty coexisted with military function. Saruman would destroy all of it. Not immediately. Not in the first decades. The destruction of Isengard's beauty was gradual, a slow, incremental process of neglect and replacement that mirrored the gradual corruption of the being who inhabited the fortress. The gardens died not because Saruman tore them out in a fit of malice, but because Saruman stopped caring about gardens. His attention was elsewhere. His intelligence was occupied with other matters, and the gardens, untended, died. What replaced the gardens was infrastructure. Slowly, over decades, the Valley of Isengard was transformed from a place of beauty into a place of function. Storage, workspaces, the beginnings of the industrial complex that would eventually produce the forges and the breeding pits and the war machinery that Merry and Pippin would find when the Ents brought the water crashing through. The transformation of Isengard's valley from garden to factory is the most precise physical expression of Saruman's psychological transformation. A garden is a relationship with living things, a relationship of tending, of patience, of working with what is there, rather than imposing what you want to be there. A factory is a relationship with dead materials, a relationship of extraction, of processing, of converting raw inputs into designed outputs. Saruman stopped gardening and started manufacturing, and the stop and start was the external expression of the internal shift from the mode of being that works with the world to the mode that works on it. Part 5b. The centuries of genuine service. Here is the thing that most discussions of Saruman skip, and it is essential. For centuries, he was good at the job. Not pretending to be good. Actually good. His analysis of the strategic situation was accurate. His counsel to the kingdoms of the West was sound. His management of the White Council's deliberations produced genuine cooperation between peoples who had been suspicious of each other for millennia. The stewards of Gondor trusted Saruman because Saruman's advice had been consistently reliable across multiple generations of stewards. The elvish leaders of the council respected Saruman because Saruman's strategic assessments had been consistently perceptive. The free peoples of the West were better organized, better informed, and better prepared because of Saruman's genuine contributions to their defense. This is not a footnote in the corruption story. It is the foundation on which the corruption was built. Because the trust that Saruman earned across centuries of genuine service was the specific resource that the corruption later exploited. consider what those centuries of genuine service actually looked like from the perspective of the peoples Saruman served. For a steward of Gondor in the mid-Third Age, Saruman was a figure of awesome reliability. The wizard who had been advising Gondor's leadership since before the current steward's great-great-grandfather had been born. The intelligence that had helped navigate strategic crises that would have overwhelmed lesser counselors. The voice of institutional wisdom that spoke with the weight of centuries of demonstrated competence. When a counselor has been right about strategy for 500 years, you do not seriously question his judgment in year 501. Even if the advice feels slightly different, even if the recommendation produces a faint discomfort you cannot quite articulate. The track record is too strong. The accumulated evidence of competence is too overwhelming. You trust the advisor because the advisor has earned the trust, and earned trust does not expire on a schedule. This is the mechanism the corruption rode. Not deception, in the simple sense, not lies and disguises and deliberate misdirection. Something more subtle, the exploitation of justified confidence. The corruption used the real trust that Saruman had really earned through real service to deflect the scrutiny that would have revealed the corruption's progress. Earned trust is the most dangerous material in politics. It is the shield behind which betrayal hides for decades. The leader who has earned your trust through centuries of competent service receives the benefit of the doubt when his decisions become questionable. You assume the best. You extend the courtesy that loyalty deserves. You attribute the strange decision to superior intelligence rather than to compromised judgment. And by the time the benefit of the doubt has been exhausted, by the time the strange decisions have accumulated, to the point where the pattern is undeniable, the corruption has progressed beyond the point of easy reversal. Saruman exploited this dynamic. Initially, without full awareness in the early stages, he may not have been entirely conscious that his private agenda was influencing his public decisions. Later, deliberately knowing that the reservoir of trust would absorb the questionable decisions, knowing that the council members who had trusted him for centuries would extend the courtesy rather than confront the suspicion. The earned trust was real. The exploitation of the earned trust was also real. And the combination genuine service producing genuine trust that is later used to conceal genuine betrayal is the most insidious form of corruption available, because it looks exactly like continued loyalty until the moment it doesn't. Part 5c. What Orthanc meant. The fortress was not simply a strategic position. It was a mirror. Orthanc, the indestructible tower at Isengard's centre, was built by Menrians. It was a masterwork of craft, carved from a single block of dark stone, seamless, unbreakable by any force the peoples of Middle-earth could deploy. The Ents could tear down the walls of Isengard. They could not scratch Orthanc. For Saruman, for the Maya whose fundamental orientation was the appreciation of craft, Orthanc must have been intoxicating. The tower was proof of what making could accomplish. Proof that the maker's intelligence, applied with sufficient skill, could produce something that exceeded the world's ability to destroy it. Orthanc was what Saruman wanted to be. Indestructible. Unbreakable. The product of intelligence so thoroughly applied to matter that the result transcended the material's ordinary limits. The tower was the physical embodiment of the maker's dream, the dream of craft so perfect that nothing can undo it. Saruman inhabited Orthanc the way a sculptor inhabits a cathedral, with the specific quality of identification that says, "This is what I aspire to." The tower became not just his home, but his model, the standard against which he measured his own craft. The tragedy of Isengard is that Orthanc survived everything else. The gardens died, the walls fell, the pits flooded, the forges drowned. But the tower remained standing in the ruins of everything Saruman had built around it, indestructible and useless, the Maker's masterwork presiding over the Maker's failure. The tower outlasted the wizard. Orthanc was still standing when the wind blew Saruman's spirit away. The craft survived the craftsman. The making outlasted the maker. And the specific quality of that survival, the tower standing amid the wreckage, perfect and pointless, captures Saruman's story most completely. The excellence that persists after the purpose has been destroyed. Part 6. The voice and how it worked. We need to understand the voice before we go further, because the voice is the key to everything Saruman did and everything Saruman was. It is the specific capability that made his corruption possible, and that made his corruption invisible. The voice was not magic in the ordinary sense. It was not a spell that compelled obedience. It was something more subtle and more dangerous, a Maya-level capability of persuasion that operated on the listener's own reasoning process. When Saruman spoke, the listener did not feel commanded. The listener felt convinced. The listener felt that Saruman's words made sense, that the conclusions Saruman was leading them toward were their own conclusions, reached through their own reasoning, supported by their own values. The voice did not override the listener's judgment. It redirected it. It took whatever the listener already believed and wanted and feared, and it constructed a pathway from those existing beliefs and wants and fears to the specific conclusion that Saruman wanted the listener to reach. This is the most sophisticated form of manipulation available. It leaves no fingerprints. The listener walks away feeling that they decided freely. The manipulation is invisible because it works through the listener's own cognitive processes rather than against them. Think about what this means for Saruman's entire career. For 2,000 years, every person Saruman spoke to, every emissary, every council member, every lord and steward and captain, experienced Saruman as persuasive. Reasonable-wise, they did not experience him as manipulative, because manipulation that works through your own reasoning feels like good reasoning. The voice was active from the beginning, not for evil purposes, initially for the mission. The Astari were sent to coordinate the Free People's resistance through persuasion and counsel. The voice was the tool through which Saruman accomplished this coordination. It was legitimate. It was effective. It produced genuine cooperation among peoples who had been suspicious of each other for centuries. But the voice changed Saruman's relationship to the people he used it on. When your primary mode of interaction with other minds is the mode of redirecting their conclusions, you stop experiencing those minds as peers. They become instruments. The specific quality of other people's independent judgment, the quality that makes conversation different from programming, ceases to register as valuable. It becomes an obstacle, a friction, a resistance to be overcome with the correct application of the correct words. The voice turned other people into systems, into mechanisms that could be analyzed. What does this person want? What does this person fear? And operated, if I say this, they will conclude that. The system thinker's mode of intelligence, applied to the domain of human interaction, produced a being who could manage any conversation, but who could not have one. Saruman could not be persuaded. This is the other side of the voice's effect. A being who spends 2,000 years redirecting other people's conclusions loses the capacity to have its own conclusions redirected. The voice is a one-way instrument. It processes others' minds, but it does not allow others' minds to process it. Gandalf could be persuaded. Gandalf could change his mind. Gandalf could look at evidence that contradicted his expectations and say, "I was wrong." This is the specific quality that made Gandalf effective in the long run, the ability to update, to learn, to allow the world to teach him things he had not expected. Saruman could not update. The voice had calcified his thinking into a one-way flow, from his conclusions to others' acceptance. The channel flowed outward. nothing flowed back. And a mind that cannot receive correction from outside itself is a mind that cannot detect its own errors. By the time the corruption was deep enough to produce visible consequences, Saruman had been operating without the capacity for self-correction for centuries. The errors had accumulated without anyone, including Saruman himself, being able to identify them. Part 7. The White Council and the First Betrayal. In the year 2463 of the Third Age, the White Council was formed. The council was the political body through which the wise of Middle-earth organized their response to the growing shadow. Its members included the Istari, the bearers of the three elven rings Strial, Elrond and Coran, and other leaders of the elvish communities. Its purpose was to coordinate the resistance, to share intelligence, to develop strategy, to make the collective decisions that no individual leader could make alone. Saruman was chosen to lead the council. Over Galadriel's preference for Gandalf, Saruman was chosen because of the same qualities that had made him the head of the Istari: the organizational intelligence, the strategic acumen, the specific capability for managing a complex political body that the council required. And for a time, a significant time, measured in centuries, Saruman led the council well. This is the part that most discussions of Saruman's corruption skip, and it is essential. For centuries, Saruman was genuinely good at the job. His analysis of the strategic situation was accurate. His management of the council's deliberations was effective. His counsel to the kingdoms of the West was sound. The trust that the council's members placed in Saruman was earned trust, not the trust of fools deceived by a clever liar. The trust of experienced, intelligent leaders who had worked with Saruman for centuries and who had every reason, based on centuries of evidence, to believe that the White Wizard was exactly what he appeared to be. Earned trust is the most dangerous material in politics. It is the shield behind which betrayal hides. The leader who has earned your trust across centuries of good service gets the benefit of the doubt when his decisions become questionable. You assume the best. You extend the courtesy that centuries of loyalty have earned, and by the time the benefit of the doubt is exhausted, the corruption has progressed to the point where reversal is dangerous and confrontation is difficult. The first betrayal was invisible. It happened in the specific way that Saruman managed the council's response to the Dol Guldur question. Gandalf had infiltrated Dol Guldur. At enormous personal risk, Gandalf had entered the Dark Fortress in southern Mirkwood and confirmed that the power growing there was not a Nazgul or a lesser servant of Mordor. It was Sauron himself, in diminished but recovering form, rebuilding in the specific quality of patient, incremental accumulation that had characterized every one of Sauron's previous recoveries. Gandalf urged the council to attack, to strike Dol Guldur while Sauron was still weak, to drive the Dark Lord out before his recovery was complete. Saruman said no. He argued against the attack on strategic grounds: the risk, the timing, the insufficient intelligence. The arguments were plausible. They were the kind of arguments that a careful strategist might legitimately make. And they were delivered with the voice, which meant that the council members who heard them felt not that they were being overruled, but that they were being persuaded by good reasoning. The real reason for the refusal was different. And the real reason is the thing that reveals how deep the corruption had already gone. Saruman was looking for the ring. Part 8. The Ring's Search. The One Ring, the ring that Sauron had made, that Isildur had taken, that had been lost in the Gladden Fields. Saruman wanted it. He had been studying ring lore for centuries. The study had been legitimate at the beginning. Understanding Sauron's tools was a prerequisite for resisting them. But the study had progressed. Through the specific mechanism we discussed earlier, the knowledge creating the possibility creating the desire, from analytical understanding to professional admiration to the specific, consuming want that characterizes the maker confronting another maker's masterpiece. Saruman wanted to make a ring. Or, if making one was beyond his capabilities, he wanted to find the ring that Sauron had made and use it himself. The search was secret. The search was unauthorized. The search was conducted using Saruman's personal resources and his personal intelligence network, entirely outside the White Council's oversight. The head of the resistance against Sauron was conducting a private operation to acquire Sauron's most powerful weapon for his own use, and using his position as head of the council to ensure that the council's actions did not interfere with his private agenda. The Dol Guldur delay makes sense in this context. If the council attacked Dol Guldur and drove Sauron out, Sauron might flee to Mordor. If Sauron was in Mordor, the ring, when it surfaced, would travel toward Mordor, through eastern territories where Saruman had no agents and no ability to intercept it. But if Sauron stayed in Dol Guldur in the western half of Middle-earth, in the territory where Saruman's intelligence network operated, then the ring, if it surfaced, would travel through ground that Saruman controlled. Saruman delayed the council's action against Sauron because the delay served his ring search. The most important strategic decision of the White Council's history was corrupted by the leader's private agenda. The head of the resistance was preventing the resistance from acting because action would interfere with his personal acquisition of the enemy's weapon. He sent agents to the Gladden Fields, the area where Isildur had died, where the ring had been lost. Saruman's operatives searched the river, searched the marshes, searched the area with the systematic thoroughness that characterized everything Saruman did. They did not find the ring. The ring had been found centuries earlier by Degol, and had passed to Smegol, who had carried it into the caves under the Misty Mountains. Saruman's agents were searching for a ring that was no longer where they were looking. The failure did not discourage the search, it intensified it. The system thinker confronted with a problem that resisted systematic solution doubled down on the systematic approach. More agents. More resources. More investigation directed toward the single goal of finding the one object that would make Saruman permanently, undeniably, irreversibly necessary. Meanwhile, the delay he had engineered was giving Sauron exactly what Sauron needed: time. Time to rebuild, time to prepare, time to organize the recovery that would eventually produce the War of the Ring. The irony is mathematically precise. The head of the resistance against Sauron, through his pursuit of a weapon against Sauron, gave Sauron the single most valuable strategic resource available: time. Part 8b. The consequences of the delay. The White Council eventually attacked Dol Guldur. In 2941, the same year, Bilbo found the ring. The council finally acted. Saruman, who had delayed for decades, allowed the attack to proceed. Perhaps because his ring search in the Gladden Fields had failed, and he calculated that Sauron might lead him to the ring. Perhaps because the pressure from Gandalf and Galadriel had become too great to resist without revealing his private agenda. The council drove Sauron from Dol Guldur. But the victory was hollow. Sauron was ready. He had anticipated the council's action. He had used the decades of delay, the decades that Saruman's obstruction had provided, to prepare a strategic withdrawal. He did not fall back in disorder. He retreated to Mordor, where his preparations were already far advanced: the fortification of Barad-dûrtha, the rebuilding of the Black Gate, the organization of the Eastern Allies, the restoration of the military infrastructure that the last alliance had destroyed 3,000 years before. The attack on Dol Guldur did not weaken Sauron. It moved him to a stronger position. If Gandalf had gotten his way, if the council had attacked when Gandalf first urged it, decades earlier, when Sauron was genuinely vulnerable, the outcome might have been transformative. Sauron, in the early stages of his Dol Guldur recovery, was less powerful, less prepared, less able to execute an organized retreat. An earlier strike might have caught him genuinely off guard. might have disrupted his recovery in ways that a later strike could not. Saruman's delays prevented the earlier strike, and the prevention gave Sauron the time to prepare for the later one. This is the most concrete, measurable, historically significant damage that Saruman's private agenda inflicted on the Free People's cause. Not the later damage, not the Uruk-hai at Helm's Deep, not the poisoning of Thodon's court, not the scouring of the Shire. This earlier, quieter, completely invisible damage, the prevention of the right action at the right time. The specific harm of inaction when action would have changed everything. In military strategy, timing is everything. A force that is devastating at one moment may be merely disruptive at a later moment, because the enemy has had time to prepare defenses. Saruman's delays gave Sauron that time. The head of the resistance, through the management of the resistance's decision-making process, gave the enemy the single most valuable resource: decades to prepare for the war that the resistance should have prevented. Part 8c: Saruman and the Shire. Saruman's interest in the Shire was not an afterthought. It was not the random malice of a defeated wizard lashing out at the nearest vulnerable target. Saruman had been watching the Shire for a very long time. He knew about the hobbit's pipeweed, the specific herb that the Shire produced, and that Saruman had come to enjoy the small indulgence that Gandalf noticed, and that the other members of the council remarked on. The pipeweed created a trade connection, a supply chain, however informal, that brought goods from the Shire to Isengard. And where there is a supply chain, there is intelligence. Saruman built an intelligence network in the Shire, not the heavy-handed spy network that a Mordor might deploy. A light touch, commercially embedded, barely visible network that gathered information through the natural channels of trade and gossip. The merchants and intermediaries who carried pipeweed to Isengard also carried information about the Shire, who lived where, who was doing what was happening in the small world of hobbit politics. Lotho Sackville Baggins was Saruman's hobbit. The acquisitive, ambitious member of the Sackville Baggins family, the family that Bilbo found so annoying and that Frodo found so tedious, was the specific kind of hobbit that Saruman's system could recruit. Lotho wanted more than the Shire offered. He wanted property, influence, the specific quality of being in charge that the Shire's gentle democracy did not provide. Saruman offered him exactly what he wanted in exchange for cooperation with Isengard's long-term plans. The recruitment was the Wormtongue operation in miniature. Find the person whose desires align with your purposes and give them what they want in exchange for what you need. Saruman's system thinking, applied to the domain of hobbit politics, produced the same result it produced everywhere: the conversion of an independent community into a managed resource. But the Shire also frustrated Saruman in a way that nothing else in Middle-earth did. The hobbits kept doing things that his analysis could not predict. Bilbo found the ring. An ordinary hobbit, on an adventure that Saruman's analysis would have dismissed as irrelevant, stumbled onto the most important object in the world. No system predicted this. No analysis anticipated it. Bilbo resisted the ring for 60 years. The ring, which should have corrupted a hobbit rapidly, hobbits have no divine power to resist, no elvish wisdom, no special quality that any analytical framework would identify as ring-resistant did not corrupt Bilbo. The hobbit's modesty, his small desires, his specific quality of wanting a comfortable life and nothing more, was a defense that no analysis could have predicted, and no system could have engineered. Frodo carried the ring to Mordor. Sam gave the ring back voluntarily. Merry and Pippin survived the Uruk-hai and reached Fangorn and met Treebeard. Every interaction between Saruman's system and the hobbits produced an outcome that the system did not anticipate. The hobbits were the variable that the system could not contain, the element that operated outside the framework. that did things for reasons the framework could not analyze, that responded to situations in ways the framework could not predict. The system thinker looked at hobbits and saw irrelevance. Small, weak, insignificant creatures with no military capability, no political influence, no quality that the system thinker's analysis could identify as strategically significant. The system thinker was catastrophically wrong. The hobbits were the most significant factor in the entire Third Age. The ring's destruction, the event that determined the war's outcome, was accomplished by hobbits. The qualities that made hobbits irrelevant to the system thinker's analysis, the modesty, the small desires, the specific quality of being content with a garden and a meal and the love of friends, were the exact qualities that made them capable of carrying the ring where no greater being could carry it. Saruman could not see this. His intelligence could not perceive the specific quality that made hobbits important, because that quality was the opposite of what his intelligence was tuned to detect. The system thinker sees systems. The system thinker does not see the beings who are too small, too modest, too unsystematic to register as components. The hobbits were outside the system, and the things outside the system were the things that mattered most. Part 9. The Palantir. In the Tower of Orthanc, there was a seeing stone, one of the Palantri, the far-seeing stones of Menor, crafted by the Noldor in Valinor, distributed among the Nadain's kingdoms for communication across great distances. The stones were connected to each other. Each stone could communicate with the others, allowing the users to see and speak across hundreds of miles. The Palantri were not evil. They were tools, sophisticated, powerful tools created for legitimate communication. Using a Palantir was not an act of darkness. But Sauron had a Palantir too. The Ithil stone, taken from Minas Ithil when it fell to the Nazgul, was in Sauron's possession. Through the network of the seeing stones, anyone who used a Palantir was potentially in contact with the Dark Lord. Saruman looked into the Orthanc stone, and at some point we do not know exactly when he found Sauron looking back. What happened through the Palantir was not the brute force corruption that some readers imagine. Sauron did not reach through the stone and seize Saruman's mind. The Palantri could not lie, they showed true visions. What Sauron could do was curate. He could direct the viewer's attention towards specific portions of the truth. He could show Saruman exactly the things that Saruman's specific psychology was most vulnerable to. Sauron showed Saruman the Eastern Empire, the armies, the organizational structure, the comprehensive, interconnected, well-designed system of control that Sauron had built across centuries of patient work. The sheer scope of what the Dark Lord had accomplished, the military capability, the logistical infrastructure, the administrative machinery that governed vast populations with a degree of coordination that the free peoples could not approach. For the system thinker, for the Maya, whose fundamental orientation was the admiration of well-designed systems, this was devastating. Not because it was frightening. Because it was magnificent. The free peoples had nothing comparable. Their alliance was a loose collection of independent kingdoms, whose cooperation was sporadic, and whose mutual suspicion was chronic. Their military capability was fragmented across dozens of independent command structures. Their intelligence sharing was minimal. Their strategic planning was reactive rather than proactive. Sauron's system was the opposite: unified, coordinated, proactive, comprehensive, everything Saruman's analytical intelligence valued in a system, Sauron's empire possessed. And the Palantir did not show the costs. Sauron selected what Saruman saw. And the suffering, the enslaved populations, the crushed cultures, the human misery that the system produced and required was not selected. Saruman saw the machine. He did not see the people the machine was grinding. This is the Palantir's deepest effect. It showed the system without the suffering. It presented Sauron's empire as a technical achievement rather than a moral catastrophe. And the system thinker, whose mode of evaluation was technical rather than moral, who assessed things on the basis of how well they worked rather than what they worked for, looked at the technical achievement and felt the specific, professional, almost involuntary admiration that one craftsman feels for another craftsman's masterwork. The admiration was the turning point. Not the admiration of evil Saruman did not admire Sauron's purposes. The admiration of design. The acknowledgement, by a being whose entire identity was organized around the understanding of how systems work, that Sauron's system worked magnificently. From admiration to emulation is a short step for a maker. And Saruman took it. Part 9b. What Sauron did not show. The Palantir showed true visions. This constraint is critical. The stones cannot lie. But the selection of which truths to show is itself a form of deception, and Sauron's selection was precise. Sauron did not show Saruman the Nazgul's victims. He did not show the specific quality of suffering that the Ring Wraith's existence produced, not just their own suffering, the 9 kings stretched and emptied by the 9 rings, until they were nothing but extensions of Sauron's will, but the suffering they inflicted, the dread that preceded them, the despair that accompanied them, the specific quality of hope destroying terror that was their primary weapon. Sauron did not show Saruman the Eastern population's actual condition. The Easterlings and the Southrons and the peoples of Rhyn and Khand lived under Sauron's system as subjects, not as citizens. The organizational efficiency that Saruman admired was purchased through the specific currency of human freedom. The coordination was produced through coercion. The unity was maintained through fear. Sauron did not show Saruman what the system cost in human terms, because Sauron understood Saruman's specific vulnerability. The system thinker evaluates systems on the basis of their performance, not their price. Show the system thinker the performance and conceal the price, and the system thinker's own analytical framework will produce the desired conclusion: this system works well. Therefore, this system is admirable. Therefore, this system should be emulated. The concealment was not lying. Every vision Saruman saw was true. The armies were real. The organization was real. The coordination was real. But truth is not simply the absence of falsehood. Truth is the complete picture. And the complete picture, including the suffering, including the enslavement, including the human cost of the magnificent machine, was not what Sauron showed. Saruman's analytical intelligence, operating on incomplete data that it believed to be complete, produced conclusions that were logically valid, but factually wrong. The analysis was flawless. The data was curated. And the flawless analysis of curated data produced the specific quality of confident wrongness that is the most dangerous possible state for a decision-maker. The state of being absolutely certain about a conclusion that is absolutely wrong. Denethor experienced the same mechanism through the same device. But Denethor's response was despair the conclusion that Sauron's power was unbeatable and that resistance was futile. Denethor saw the armies and concluded that fighting was hopeless. Saruman saw the same armies and concluded that fighting was insufficient, that the response to overwhelming organized power was not resistance but competition. Not the rejection of the system, but the construction of a better system. The difference between Denethor's despair and Saruman's ambition is the difference between a mortal mind overwhelmed by the scale of evil and a divine mind impressed by the design of evil. Both responses were wrong. Both were produced by the same manipulated information stream. But the specific wrongness was different, because the specific vulnerability was different. Denethor was vulnerable to hopelessness. Saruman was vulnerable to admiration. And the admiration was more dangerous than the hopelessness. Because the hopelessness produced paralysis, and the admiration produced action, and the action was the construction of a competing system that replicated the methods of the thing it was supposed to oppose. Part 10. The conclusion that destroyed everything. The conclusion that the Palantir produced in Saruman's mind, the specific, analytical, logically defended conclusion that became the foundation of everything he did from this point forward, was this: the free peoples need a competing system. Not advice, not counsel, not the gentle guidance of the Astari mission. A system, an organized, centralized, coordinated system of power that could match Sauron's system in scale and efficiency. A system that could do what the free people's chaotic freedom could not, produce unified action toward a unified purpose. And the system needed a center, a brain, an intelligence capable of coordinating the disparate elements into a functioning whole. It needed Saruman. The conclusion seemed reasonable. The conclusion was delivered with the specific quality of analytical rigor that Saruman brought to everything. The conclusion was, in fact, correct in its diagnosis. The free peoples did need better coordination. The free peoples did suffer from their inability to organize a unified response to unified threats. The conclusion was wrong in its prescription. Because the prescription required exactly the thing that the Astari mission was designed to prevent: the exercise of Maya-level power for domination rather than counsel. The Astari were sent in the bodies of old men specifically to prevent this. The limitation was deliberate. The Valar understood that the deployment of divine intelligence without constraint would inevitably lead to the pride of power, the specific corruption that turned helper into ruler and ruler into tyrant. The Astari were constrained because the constraint was the mission's most important feature. Saruman accepted the constraint and then, across centuries, dismantled it. The dismantling was gradual. The dismantling was always justified. The dismantling always had a reason, a strategic necessity, a tactical imperative, a circumstance that required the constraint to be relaxed just this once. Just in this case. Just because the situation demands it. The constraint was relaxed through 1,000 small exceptions until the constraint was gone and only the exceptions remained. This is how it works. This is how it always works. Not the dramatic rejection of the rules. The gradual, justified, reasonable, case-by-case erosion of the rules until the rules exist in name only, and the being who is supposed to follow them is doing whatever he wants while pointing to the rules as proof of his legitimacy. Part 10b. Saruman and Gondor. Saruman's relationship with Gondor is one of the least discussed and most important political dimensions of his pre-war career. Gondor gave Saruman the keys to Orthanc. This act of trust a sovereign kingdom entrusting one of its most strategically important fortresses to an external party was based on centuries of positive interaction between the wizard and the kingdom. The stewards trusted Saruman because Saruman had earned the trust through decades of reliable counsel. But Saruman's relationship with Gondor was also instrumental. The system thinker looked at Gondor and saw a declining power, a kingdom that had once been the greatest in the West but that was now diminished, its northern kingdom destroyed, its population thinned by plague and war, its ruling line reduced to stewards rather than kings. The decline of Gondor was, for Saruman, both a problem and an opportunity. A problem because Gondor was the primary bulwark against Sauron in the south, and its weakness left the free peoples more vulnerable. An opportunity because Gondor's decline created a power vacuum that Saruman's own growing capability could fill. The stewards were not fools. They were practical men. The ruling stewards of the later Third Age were competent administrators who managed a difficult inheritance with skill and dedication. Denethor II, the steward who would ultimately face Sauron's assault on Minas Tirith, was among the most capable rulers Gondor had produced in generations. But Denethor mistrusted Gandalf. This mistrust, which Tolkien describes with specific attention, created an opening for Saruman. If Denethor would not accept counsel from Gandalf, he might accept counsel from the head of the Astari Order. And counsel, filtered through Saruman's agenda, became another instrument of the corruption. Advice that was technically sound, but that consistently directed Gondor's attention away from the specific actions that would have been most effective against Sauron. Saruman did not actively sabotage Gondor. The relationship was more subtle than sabotage. It was the specific quality of counsel that is accurate in its assessment, but misleading in its recommendations. The counsel that identifies the right problem and proposes the wrong solution. The advice that is helpful enough to maintain trust, but insufficiently helpful to produce the outcomes the situation requires. This mode of corrupt counsel, the advisor, who is close enough to right to be trusted, but far enough from right to be harmful, is the most difficult form of corruption to detect. Because the difference between genuinely helpful advice and strategically unhelpful advice is often invisible to the person receiving it. You have to be able to see the advisor's full picture, including the advisor's private agenda, to understand why the advice, while plausible, consistently fails to produce the best possible outcome. The stewards could not see Saruman's full picture. They saw the White Wizard. They saw the head of the Order. They saw the being who had been providing counsel to their predecessors for centuries. They did not see the ring search. They did not see the Palantir contacts. They did not see the private agenda that was shaping every recommendation. By the time Denethor acquired his own Palantir and began to see things for himself, by the time the steward's independent intelligence capability revealed a world that did not match Saruman's assessments, the damage was done. Denethor's despair, produced by the Palantir's curated visions, was partly a response to the specific quality of having been misled, the realization that the world was worse than the trusted advisor had been telling him. Part 11. The relationship with Rohan. The corruption expressed itself first through politics. Before the armies, before the Uruk-hai, before the industrial transformation of Isengard politics, because politics is where the system thinker's intelligence operates most naturally, and political corruption is the least visible kind. Rohan was Saruman's primary political target. The Horse Kingdom occupied the territory directly south and east of Isengard, and the relationship between Isengard and Rohan was the most important political relationship in Saruman's world. Initially, the relationship was positive. Saruman was the White Wizard, the guardian of the Gap, the trusted ally. The Rohirrim respected him. The arrangement was mutually beneficial in ways that both parties valued. The shift from alliance to manipulation was incremental. Step by step, over decades, Saruman's relationship with Rohan moved from the mode of partnership to the mode of management. From seeing Rohan as an ally to seeing Rohan as a resource. From asking, how can we help each other? To asking, how can I use this? The specific mechanism of the shift was the Wormtongue operation, the most sophisticated political manipulation in the mythology, and the most complete expression of Saruman's system thinking applied to the domain of political control. Gurma, son of Glemd, was Saruman's instrument. Not a spy in the simple sense, Gurma was a political operative placed in Thodun's court through years of careful positioning, given the specific brief of becoming the king's most trusted counselor and using that position to redirect Rohan's policy towards Saruman's purposes. The placement was precise. In any political system, the chief counselor controls the information environment. The chief counselor decides what the leader hears, how the leader hears it, and which options the leader considers. Saruman identified this position as the single most effective leverage point in Thodun's kingdom and placed his agent in it. Gurma did not need to lie. He needed to frame. The specific technique was not fabrication, but selection and emphasis, choosing which truths to present and how to present them, which threats to highlight and which opportunities to minimize. creating an information environment in which the conclusions Saruman wanted the king to reach became the only conclusion the information supported. Rohan was genuinely threatened. The Dunlendings were hostile, the orcs were raiding, Mordor's shadow was growing. Everything Germa told Thodin was true. The manipulation was not in the content, but in the architecture, the specific way the true information was assembled to produce the impression that action was hopeless and passivity was wisdom. The voice operated through Germa. Not the full supernatural voice. Germa was not a Maya. But the technique of the voice, the method of redirection, the specific skill of making the listener feel that the conclusion they are being led to is their own. This was teachable. And Saruman taught it. Germa learned the method. Germa applied the method. And Thodin's court, without being aware that anything unusual was happening, gradually shifted from independence to civility. By the time Gandalf arrived at Edoras to break the enchantment, Rohan had been neutralized. The most powerful cavalry in western Middle-earth was sitting idle, its king too deep in managed despair to call the muster. Gandalf broke it in minutes. The spell that had taken years to build collapsed in a single scene. Thodin standing, reaching for his sword, stepping into the sunlight for the first time in what felt like years. The disparity between the time required to corrupt and the time required to heal is one of the story's most important lessons. Corruption is patient and incremental. Healing is sudden and requires only the specific act of someone speaking the truth in a room full of lies. Part 11b. The Dunlendings and the Exploitation of Grievance. Saruman's political manipulation extended beyond Rohan's court. The Dunlendings, the wild men who inhabited the hills to the west of Rohan, who had been dispossessed of their lands when the Rohirrim arrived in the region centuries earlier, were another population that Saruman's system thinking identified as a usable resource. The Dunlendings had a legitimate grievance. They had been pushed out of their ancestral territory by the Rohirrim's expansion. They nursed the specific, generational quality of resentment that belongs to a displaced people watching their former homeland occupied by others. The resentment was real. The injustice had been real. The Dunlendings were not wrong to feel what they felt. Saruman used the grievance. The system thinker looked at the Dunlendings and saw an exploitable resource, a population with a built-in motivation to fight Rohan, requiring only the specific inputs of organization, armament, and direction to become a military force that served Saruman's purposes. He did not resolve the grievance. He did not seek justice for the Dunlendings. He amplified the resentment, directed it, gave it weapons and purpose, and pointed it at Rohan, not because Dunlending justice was his goal, but because Dunlending violence was his tool. This is the specific diagnostic quality of the system thinker's relationship to other people's suffering. Suffering is a resource. Grievance is a lever. The pain of real people with real complaints is raw material that the system can convert into the specific outputs the system needs. The Dunlendings who fought at Helm's Deep, who charged into the fortress alongside Saruman's Uruk-hai, who died in the battle that Saruman had orchestrated, were not fighting for Saruman's vision of organized power. They were fighting for their land. They were fighting for the specific, human, entirely understandable desire to reclaim what had been taken from them. Saruman used that desire, weaponized it, directed it toward an outcome that served his purposes, while offering the Dunlendings nothing except the opportunity to die for goals that were not their own. After the battle, when the Dunlendings who survived were shown mercy by the Rohirrim, when Thodin, restored and clear-eyed, allowed the defeated Dunlendings to go home, the Dunlendings wept. They had expected to be killed. They had been taught by Saruman's agents that the Rohirrim would show no mercy. The mercy was unexpected. The mercy was, in its way, more devastating than defeat, because it revealed the lie that Saruman's system had been built on. The system told the Dunlendings that the Rohirrim were monsters. The Rohirrim showed the Dunlendings mercy. And the gap between the system's claim and the reality's truth was the specific, precise measure of the system's corruption. Part 11c. What control actually costs. Saruman controlled Rohan through Gurma. He controlled the Dunlendings through agents. He controlled the information environment of the White Council through the Voice. He controlled the strategic direction of the Free People's resistance through his position as the Council's head. By the years immediately before the War of the Ring, Saruman was the most extensively connected political operator in Western Middle-earth. His network reached into Rohan's court, into the Shire's economy, into the Council's deliberations, into the specific information channels through which the Free Peoples made their decisions. And all of it, every thread of the network, every agent, every channel of influence was oriented toward a single purpose, Saruman's private agenda. The recovery of the ring, the construction of a competing power center, the replacement of Sauron's system with Saruman's system. The cost of maintaining this network was the cost that every controlling intelligence pays, the loss of genuine relationship. When you control someone, you cannot know them. Control requires the specific quality of seeing the other person as an instrument, a mechanism whose inputs and outputs you manage. But knowing someone, genuinely understanding another person's experience, sharing their perspective, receiving their honest feedback requires the opposite. The quality of seeing the other person as a person, an independent consciousness whose perspective is valuable precisely because it is not yours. Saruman controlled everyone around him. He knew no one. Gandalf controlled no one. He knew everyone. Gandalf knew Bilbo knew the specific quality of hobbit courage that would allow Bilbo to have mercy on Gollum. Gandalf knew Frodo knew the specific quality of hobbit faithfulness that would allow Frodo to carry the ring to Mordor. Gandalf knew Sam knew the specific quality of hobbit love that would sustain Frodo when everything else failed. Gandalf knew Théoden knew the specific quality of kingly dignity that was still present underneath Gurma's enchantment. Gandalf's knowledge was the knowledge of a person who had spent 2,000 years listening, not directing. Listening, paying attention to other people's experiences, other people's values, other people's specific quality of being themselves. The knowledge was relational. It required the specific act of allowing other people to be independent of your purposes. Saruman's knowledge was the knowledge of a controller. He knew what people wanted because he needed to know in order to manipulate them. He knew what people feared because he needed to know in order to leverage them. His knowledge was instrumental. It served his purposes. It did not serve the people he knew. The difference between these two kinds of knowledge, relational knowledge and instrumental knowledge, is the difference between the wizard who saved the world and the wizard who nearly destroyed it. Both knew Middle-earth. Both had spent 2,000 years studying its peoples. Both possessed extraordinary analytical capability. One used the knowledge to help, the other used the knowledge to manage. And here is the final cruelty of the distinction. Saruman's instrumental knowledge was technically more accurate than Gandalf's relational knowledge. Saruman's intelligence files on the Shire were more detailed than Gandalf's personal familiarity with hobbit life. Saruman's strategic analysis of Rohan's vulnerabilities was more comprehensive than Gandalf's intuitive sense of Théoden's character. In a contest of pure information, who knows more facts about the subject, Saruman would win every time. But the contest was never about facts. It was about understanding, and understanding the specific, irreplaceable quality of knowing what something means, rather than merely knowing what something is, requires the kind of attention that control cannot produce. The controller sees the mechanism. The friend sees the person. The mechanism is easier to analyze. The person is more important to understand. Saruman analyzed the mechanism of Middle-earth with unmatched precision. Gandalf understood the people of Middle-earth with unmatched depth. And the understanding, not the analysis, was what the mission required. Part 12. Radagast and the things Saruman could not see. Radagast the Brown, the third of the Western Astari, the wizard who loved birds and beasts and growing things. Saruman despised him. Radagast the bird tamer, Radagast the simple, Radagast the fool. The contempt is specific and revealing. Saruman looked at a fellow Maya, a fellow member of the Astari Order, a being of genuine divine capability, and saw a fool. Because Radagast's orientation toward the world was not organized around the things Saruman valued: strategy, organization, the analysis and management of systems. Radagast talked to birds. Radagast studied the movements of animal populations. Radagast walked in the forests and attended to the specific quality of the natural world with the patient, fascinated attention of someone who finds the world endlessly worthy of observation, simply for being what it is. This orientation, the orientation of the naturalist, the being who attends to the world for its own sake, was the exact orientation that would have protected Saruman from the corruption. The being who finds the world worth attending to for its own sake does not need to control the world, does not need to organize it, does not need to convert it from what it is into what the being thinks it should be. Radagast could never have fallen the way Saruman fell, not because Radagast was morally superior, because Radagast's mode of attention did not produce the desire that the corruption needed as its foundation. The desire to improve, to organize, to systematize this desire, which was the Maker's desire, the all-household desire. The specific engine of Saruman's corruption, this desire, was absent in Radagast. Radagast wanted to understand the world, not change it. And the being who wants to understand rather than change is not vulnerable to the temptation to control. Saruman's contempt for Radagast was the contempt of the serious for the simple. And it was precisely wrong. The simple thing that Saruman despised was the thing that could have saved him. The specific irony, Radagast's birds were the ones that carried the message to the eagles. The eagles rescued Gandalf from the top of Orthanc. Saruman used Radagast as an unwitting instrument to lure Gandalf to Isengard. And Radagast's natural connections, the relationships with birds that Saruman found so laughable, provided the mechanism of Gandalf's escape. The simple thing defeated the sophisticated thing. The bird tamer's relationships proved more consequential than the system thinker's strategies. And Saruman, who had analyzed everything, had not analyzed the possibility that the things he had dismissed as irrelevant might turn out to be decisive. Part 12b. The contempt for hobbits. There is a parallel blindness that deserves mention alongside the Radagast contempt, because it reveals the same flaw from a different angle: Saruman's attitude toward hobbits. Saruman studied hobbits. He learned about the Shire, its geography, its governance, its pipeweed trade. He sent agents into the Shire to gather intelligence. The study was thorough. The study was also completely wrong in its orientation. Saruman studied hobbits the way a naturalist studies insects as specimens, objects of analysis, things to be understood, categorized, and when the time came, controlled. He never once, in the entire 2,000-year span of his activities, considered hobbits as beings who might matter, who might be consequential, who might, in the end, accomplish the thing that the entire military and diplomatic and magical capability of the free peoples could not accomplish. Gandalf loved hobbits, not in an abstract analytical way, in the specific, personal way that you love people you have spent time with and whose company you genuinely enjoy. Gandalf visited the Shire, smoked pipe weed with the hobbits, told stories, set off fireworks at parties. did the specific, humble, socially embedded thing that builds genuine understanding. He paid attention to them as people, rather than as data points. This difference, Saruman's analytical study versus Gandalf's personal engagement, is the difference that determined the ring's fate. Because Gandalf's love of hobbits was the reason Gandalf understood what hobbits were capable of. And Gandalf's understanding of hobbits was the reason the ring went to Mordor with a hobbit rather than with a warrior or a wizard. And the hobbit's specific qualities, humility, stubbornness, love of home, resistance to the ring's seduction, were the qualities that carried the ring to the fire. Saruman knew everything about hobbits that could be captured in a dossier. Gandalf knew everything about hobbits that could only be known by loving them. And the knowledge that came from love was the knowledge that mattered. Part 13. The study of ring lore and the seduction of knowledge. The study of ring lore deserves a section of its own because it is the most precise illustration of how knowledge itself can be a mechanism of corruption. Not all knowledge corrupts. Knowing the boiling point of water does not change who you are. But certain kinds of knowledge about how power works, how wills can be extended and imposed, how one mind can dominate another through the medium of a crafted object, this knowledge changes the consciousness that receives it. The knowledge changes you because it creates possibilities that did not previously exist in your mind. Before you understand how the rings of power were made, the possibility of making a ring is abstract, theoretical, irrelevant to your daily thought. After you understand, the possibility is concrete, detailed, alive with the specific quality of "I could actually do this" that separates fantasy from planning. The existence of the possibility exerts a pressure, a gentle, continuous, almost imperceptible pressure in the direction of actualization. The mind that contains the possibility returns to it, explores it, imagines what it would mean, and each return, each exploration, each imagining, moves the mind incrementally closer to the state where the actualization begins to seem not merely possible, but reasonable. Saruman's study of ring lore followed this progression across decades. Each new piece of understanding about how the rings were made the principles of ring craft, the mechanisms through which a Maya's will could be externalized into a physical object, the specific techniques of what Tolkien calls the sub-creative art applied to the domain of domination, each piece added to the catalogue of possibility in Saruman's mind. And the catalogue grew. And the desire grew with it. For a Maya of Ul's household, the desire was not moral weakness. It was professional instinct. The craftsman who understands how a masterwork was made feels the pull toward replication. The engineer who comprehends how a system operates feels the pull toward building one. The knowledge generates the desire because the knowledge activates the specific quality of the maker's nature that wants to express itself in making. Saruman's desire to make a ring was the maker's desire corrupted by the maker's subject matter. If Saruman had studied agriculture with the same analytical intensity he brought to ring lore, the desire would have been to build a better irrigation system. If he had studied music, the desire would have been to compose a symphony. The maker's desire is neutral in itself. It takes its moral quality from the thing it wants to make. Saruman studied domination, and the maker's desire wanted to make domination. Gandalf understood this danger. Gandalf refused to study ring lore deeply. Not because Gandalf was incurious, because Gandalf was wise enough to know that the understanding would create the desire, and the desire would eventually test his resistance in ways he was not confident his resistance could survive. Saruman was confident. The specific, well-founded, entirely reasonable confidence that his moral fiber was strong enough to handle the knowledge without being affected by it. The expert's assurance that he could study the dangerous thing without becoming the thing he studied. He was wrong, not because his moral fiber was weak, because no moral fiber is strong enough to sustain indefinite exposure to the detailed knowledge of how to do something you are constitutively disposed to want to do. The maker cannot study making without wanting to make. The system thinker cannot study systems of control without wanting to build one. The wise person knows what they cannot safely know. Saruman did not know this about himself, and the not knowing was the specific gap in his self, understanding that the corruption exploited. Part 14. The building of the machine. In the decades immediately before the War of the Ring, the theoretical corruption became physical. The maker who had spent centuries studying and wanting began, at last, to make. Isengard was transformed. The gardens that had already been dying from neglect were now actively destroyed not through malice, but through the specific requirements of industrial production. The valley was excavated. Pits were dug. Forges were built. The physical infrastructure of a war machine emerged from the ground like something that had been buried there waiting. The forests were felled. The trees around Isengard, ancient trees that Treebeard and the Ents had watched over for centuries, were cut down to feed the furnaces. Timber became fuel. Fuel fed the forges. The forges made weapons. The weapons armed the soldiers. The system was complete. Natural resources in, military capability out. Saruman looked at the forest and saw fuel. This is the specific mode of seeing that defines the corruption in its physical dimension. The mode that evaluates everything in terms of what it can be used for. The mode that cannot see a tree as a tree, can only see a tree as a quantity of combustible material with a calculable energy output. The Ents were watching. Treebeard had been watching Isengard for centuries. Watching the gardens die, watching the trees fall, watching the smoke rise from the pits. The Ents were patient, immeasurably patient. Patient on the timescale of geological processes. But the Ents were not passive. They were waiting. Waiting to see if the destruction would stop. If the wizard who had been given the stewardship of the valley would remember what stewardship means. The destruction did not stop. And the Ents' patience, which had endured for centuries, ran out. But that is later. For now, the machine was being built, and the machine's most disturbing product was being bred. The Uruk-hai. Saruman's masterwork. The thing the maker's desire had been building toward for decades of ring study and ring lore, and the growing conviction that the world needed to be organized by force. The Uruk-hai were not simply orcs. They were improved orcs. Larger, stronger, more disciplined, capable of sustained action in daylight. They were the product of systematic breeding, the application of the maker's intelligence to the domain of biology, the specific act of treating living things as design problems to be solved through iterative improvement. Tolkien suggests that Saruman may have crossed orcs with men. The implication is not confirmed in every version of the text, but the possibility is present. And the possibility is what matters. The possibility that Saruman used human beings as breeding stock in a biological engineering program. That the maker's desire, directed toward the production of better soldiers, crossed a moral boundary that even the corrupted wizard should have recognized as uncrossable. The Uruk-hai are Saruman's craft, his creation. The thing the maker in him produced when the maker's desire was directed toward war. They are the answer to the question that the corruption asked across centuries of ring study. What can I make? Saruman could make soldiers. Effective, disciplined, daylight-tolerant soldiers who could march and fight and sustain operations that ordinary orcs could not. The craft was genuine. The improvement was real. The system worked. And the system's product was death. The Uruk-hai killed Boromir. The Uruk-hai carried Merry and Pippin toward Isengard. The Uruk-hai assaulted Helm's Deep. Every death the Uruk-hai produced was a product of Saruman's craftsmanship, the Maker's gift directed toward making killers. Part 14b. The Ents and what the system could not contain. Saruman cut down the trees around Isengard to feed his furnaces. He did this knowing what the trees were. He knew about the Ents. He knew that the forest of Fangorn, which bordered his territory, was watched over by the oldest and most patient shepherds in the world. He knew, and he did not care. This is the specific, diagnostic quality of the corruption in its most advanced stage, the inability to assign value to things that do not serve the system. The trees had value, they were alive, they were ancient. They were the specific kind of living thing that Tolkien's mythology treats with the reverence that real forests deserve. But the value was not systemic. The trees could not be converted into military capability. They could not be incorporated into the organizational structure. They could not serve the purpose that the system was designed to serve. They could, however, be burned. As fuel, the trees had measurable value. The timber could be calculated in terms of energy output, forge hours, weapons produced. The system could process trees. The system could not see trees. Treebeard, the oldest living thing in Middle-earth, a being who had watched the forests grow since before the elves awoke, noticed what was happening. The Ents had been watching Isengard for a long time. They had watched the gardens die. They had watched the first trees fall. They had watched the smoke begin to rise from the pits. The Ents were patient. Patient on a timescale that no mortal mind could comprehend. Patient the way geological processes are patient the slow, steady, imperceptible progression of a response that takes centuries to build and seconds to express. Saruman's system did not account for the Ents. The system thinker's analysis included military forces, political dynamics, economic resources, information channels. The analysis did not include trees that walk. The category tree appeared in the analysis only under raw materials. The subcategory tree that has an opinion about being cut down and burned did not exist. The Ents' assault on Isengard was the natural world's rejection of the system thinker's abuse of the natural world. The trees walked. The trees tore down the walls. The trees broke the dam and released the water that drowned the pits and the forges, and the specific physical infrastructure that decades of systematic intelligence had designed and built. The Ents destroyed Isengard in hours. What Saruman had spent decades building, the trees demolished before sunset. The speed of the destruction is the point. The system was sophisticated. The system was complex. The system was the product of centuries of analysis and decades of construction. And the system was obliterated by a force that the system had excluded from its analysis, a force that was not strategic, not organized, not sophisticated in any way the system thinker would have recognized. Just angry. Just ancient. Just trees. Doing what trees do when you push them past the point of patience. Gandalf, who understood things that Saruman could not, had foreseen something like this, not the specific attack, but the general principle that the world contained, forces that no system could contain. There are older and fouler things than orcs in the deep places of the world, he had told the Fellowship. He might have added, and there are older and more patient things than wizards in the forests of the world. The Ents were the variable the system excluded. The things outside the system were the things that broke it. Part 14 sees Saruman of many colours. Saruman tried to go beyond white. When Gandalf arrived at Orthanc and Saruman revealed his hand, Saruman presented himself not as the white, but as Saruman of many colours. His robes shimmered the white broken into its component parts, fragmented into a spectrum, each colour visible separately where before they had been unified. Gandalf's response cuts to the bone, I liked white better. The exchange is Tolkien at his most precise. The white was the original. The white was the designation, the color of the head of the order, the color that contains all other colors in unity. Saruman's many colors are the white analyzed, deconstructed, taken apart, understood in terms of its components rather than experienced as a whole. This is what the analytical intelligence does to everything it touches. It takes apart, it separates, it identifies the components and examines them individually. And in the separation, in the individual examination, the specific quality of unity that made the whole greater than the sum of its parts is lost. White is not red plus blue plus green plus yellow. White is white. The unity is not the sum of the parts. It is something else, something that the parts do not contain. Something that exists only in the relationship between the parts when the parts are together. Saruman could see the parts. He could analyze the relationship. He could understand, with the full force of his systematic intelligence, how the colors combined to produce white. But the understanding did not produce the white. The understanding produced many colors, a shimmering, fragmented, technically more complex thing that was fundamentally less than the simple, unified thing it had replaced. Saruman had done to himself what he had done to everything else. He had analyzed his own identity. He had taken apart the unity that was Saruman the White and examined its components and reassembled them into something that was technically more sophisticated, but that had lost the specific quality, the wholeness, the unity, the single-minded purpose that had made the white meaningful. Whether Saruman actually completed a ring of power is debatable. The many colors and the general trajectory of his ring lore studies suggest he attempted something that demonstrated understanding without matching power. Something that was to the One Ring what a competent analysis is to a genuine creation. A scholar's ring. An analyst's ring. A ring that understood the principles, but lacked the specific, irreproducible quality of creative will that made Sauron's ring what it was. The many colors masquerading as white. The analysis masquerading as creation. The system thinker's understanding masquerading as the maker's power. Part 14d. The Last Council Meeting. In the year 2953 of the Third Age, the White Council met for the final time. This meeting, the last gathering of the wise before the War of the Ring, deserves specific attention, because it is the moment where Saruman's deception reached its most audacious and its most consequential point. The question before the council was the One Ring. Where was it? What should be done about it? Gandalf had been investigating. Gandalf had suspicions. Gandalf was, by this point, closer than anyone else to identifying the ring's location. His investigation of Gollum was underway. His attention was turning toward the Shire. The chain of evidence that would eventually lead to the identification of Bilbo's ring was being assembled. Saruman addressed the council. And Saruman lied. He told the council that the One Ring had been carried by the river Anduin to the sea, that the ring was lost permanently, irretrievably, beyond any possibility of recovery. He deployed the full analytical apparatus of his ring lore expertise to support this claim. The ring was heavy. The river was strong. The current would have carried it downstream over the centuries since Isildur's death, and the river emptied into the Bay of Belfalis. And the sea currents of the bay would have carried the ring into deep water, where no search could recover it. The analysis was sophisticated. The reasoning was plausible. The delivery was enhanced by the voice, which gave the analysis the specific quality of inevitability that made disagreement feel foolish. And the analysis was a lie. Not in every particular the river mechanics were real, the current calculations were legitimate. But the conclusion was false, and Saruman knew it was false, because Saruman had been searching for the ring in the Gladden fields for decades. If Saruman believed the ring was in the sea, he would not have been searching for it on land. The analysis was constructed not to inform, but to deceive, to direct the council's attention away from the ring's actual location and toward a conclusion that would cause the council to stop looking. This is the voice at its most dangerous. Not persuading the council to do something, but persuading the council to stop doing something. To stop looking. To stop investigating. To abandon the one line of inquiry that would have led to the ring's discovery. And to accept instead the comforting fiction that the ring was beyond reach. Gandalf did not believe the fiction. Gandalf's suspicions were strong enough, by this point, that no amount of voice-enhanced analysis could override them. But Gandalf was not the head of the council. Gandalf's suspicions were not the council's consensus. And the council's consensus, shaped by the voice, accepted Saruman's assurance. The investigation was not abandoned entirely. Gandalf continued his own work independently, as we have discussed. But the council as a body stopped looking for the ring. The collective intelligence and collective resources of the wise of Middle-earth were redirected away from the most important intelligence question of the age, on the basis of a sophisticated lie told by the person who had the most to gain from the redirection. This is the most consequential lie in the Third Age. Not the most dramatic, it was delivered in a council meeting, not on a battlefield. Not the most obviously evil, it was framed as analytical conclusion, not as malicious deception. But the most consequential, because the lie prevented the collective wise from finding the ring before the ring found its way into the narrative on its own terms. If the council had continued its collective investigation, if the full resources of the wise had been deployed to find the ring might have been identified earlier, might have been secured before Sauron's agents learned its location from Gollum, might have been transported to Rivendell or Rhiannon, and the Council of Elrond might have occurred years before it actually did, in a less desperate strategic context. None of this happened. Because Saruman lied to the council. And the council, trusting its leader, believed the lie. Part 15. Saruman and Sauron, the double game. The relationship between Saruman and Sauron in the years before the war was not the relationship of servant to master. It was something more complex and more unstable, the relationship of two system thinkers who each believed they could outmaneuver the other. Saruman did not serve Sauron. He intended to replace him. The goal was not to become Sauron's ally, but to become Sauron's rival, to build a competing center of power that could challenge Sauron's dominance and eventually supersede it. The ring was the key. Whoever held the One Ring held the balance of power, and Saruman's plan was to find the ring, use it to build his own dominion, and then confront Sauron from a position of strength. The Palantir communications were, from Saruman's perspective, intelligence operations. He was gathering information about Sauron's capabilities and intentions, looking for weaknesses, looking for the specific opportunities that a competing power could exploit. He showed Sauron deference because deference was tactically useful. It kept Sauron's attention directed elsewhere, while Saruman built his independent capability. Sauron knew. This is the central irony of the relationship. Sauron saw through Saruman's game immediately. The master of deception recognized the apprentice's deception without difficulty. Sauron knew that Saruman wanted the ring, knew that Saruman's cooperation was tactical, knew that Saruman's long-term goal was rivalry, not service. And Sauron didn't care, because the tactical cooperation served Sauron's short-term interests, regardless of Saruman's long-term ambitions. An Isengard that attacked Rohan weakened Rohan, whether Saruman intended the weakening to benefit himself or Sauron. A White Council paralyzed by its leader's private agenda could not coordinate effective resistance, whether the paralysis was deliberate or accidental. Sauron used Saruman the way Saruman used Gurma, as an instrument. The being who thought he was the player was, in fact, the piece. The specific quality of delusion required to sustain the double game is worth examining. Saruman believed he was smarter than Sauron. In the domain of analytical intelligence, the specific domain that Saruman valued above all others, this belief may have been accurate. Saruman's analytical capability was extraordinary. But the analytical intelligence was gathering its data through a compromised channel. The Palantir, through which Saruman conducted his intelligence operations, was under Sauron's partial control. The Master Stone dynamic gave Sauron the advantage in every Palantir communication. Sauron could direct what Saruman saw, could curate the information flow, could shape the data on which Saruman's analytical intelligence operated. Saruman was analyzing Sauron using data that Sauron was curating. He was making strategic assessments based on evidence that the subject of the assessment had selected. He was running his analytical engine on fuel that the enemy was providing. The system thinker's confidence in his own analysis prevented him from seeing this, because admitting that the analysis was compromised would mean admitting that the system thinker's most prized capability was unreliable. And that admission was the one thing Saruman's pride could not accommodate. You cannot think your way out of a corruption that is affecting the way you think. Part 16. What Gandalf knew and when he knew it. Gandalf suspected Saruman for a long time before the suspicion became certainty. The suspicion began with the Dol Guldur delays. Gandalf wanted to act against Sauron in Mirkwood. Saruman blocked the action. Once was caution. Twice was pattern. 3 times was policy. And the policy, the consistent prevention of action against the specific enemy the Astari were sent to resist, was too systematic to be explained by simple risk aversion. Gandalf began to wonder, what is Saruman waiting for? He noticed Saruman's ring law studies. The intensity of Saruman's interest in ring craft, the specific, growing, obsessive quality of the study, was visible to anyone who paid attention. And Gandalf was paying attention. He watched Saruman acquire texts, commission research, deploy agents to investigate the history of the ring's making. The scale of the study exceeded anything the mission required. He noticed the inconsistency. Saruman told the White Council that the One Ring had been carried down the Anduin to the sea gone, lost, beyond recovery. But the being who claimed the ring was gone was spending an enormous amount of time studying how rings work. If the ring was truly lost, why was Saruman so intensely interested in ringcraft? The inconsistency was a signal. Not definitive, it could be explained by academic curiosity, by the general interest of an expert in his field of expertise. But combined with the Dol Guldur delays and the growing evidence of Saruman's private operations in the Gladden Fields, the inconsistency formed a pattern. Gandalf pursued his own investigation. Independently of Saruman. Without informing the head of the council. This decision, the decision to investigate the ring outside the council's framework, without Saruman's knowledge or involvement, tells you exactly how far Gandalf's trust in Saruman had eroded. The leader of the resistance against Sauron could no longer be trusted with the most important intelligence in the world. The investigation led Gandalf to Gollum, to the Gladden Fields, to the identification of Bilbo's ring as the One Ring. And when the identification was complete, when Gandalf was certain that the ring was in the Shur, Gandalf did not tell Saruman. The head of the White Council, the leader of the Astari, the being entrusted by the Valar with the coordination of the Free People's resistance, was excluded from the knowledge that the ring had been found. Because Gandalf's assessment of Saruman's compromised state was accurate enough, by this point, that sharing the ring's location with Saruman would have been sharing it with the enemy. Part 16b. Gandalf's investigation and what it required. Gandalf's independent investigation of the ring, the investigation conducted outside the council's framework, without Saruman's knowledge, is one of the most consequential pieces of detective work in the mythology. And it required something specific from Gandalf that Saruman could never have provided: the willingness to look at small things. The investigation led Gandalf to Gollum. Not through grand strategic analysis, through the specific, patient, ground-level work of tracking an individual creature across the wilds of Middle-earth. Gandalf asked Aragorn to find Gollum. Aragorn searched through the Wilderland, through the dead marshes, through the specific geography of Gollum's post-cave wanderings. The search took years. When Gollum was found, Gandalf questioned him. Not with the voice's manipulative technique, with the specific quality of patient, compassionate, genuinely curious attention that characterizes all of Gandalf's interactions with the beings he encounters. Gandalf listened to Gollum, listened to the pathetic, fragmented, ring-obsessed babbling of a creature that 500 years in a cave had reduced to the most wretched being alive. And in the listening, Gandalf found the evidence. The ring was found in the Gladden fields. The ring had extended Gollum's life far beyond natural limits. The ring had produced the specific psychological effects that the One Ring was known to produce. The chain of custody was established. The identification was confirmed. Saruman could not have done this. Not because Saruman lacked the analytical intelligence. Because Saruman could not have listened to Gollum. The system thinker, confronted with a wretched creature babbling in the dark, would have seen an information source to be extracted, not a person to be listened to. The voice would have pressed. The analysis would have processed. The data would have been obtained. But the data alone was not sufficient. The identification required not just the facts, but the interpretation, the specific quality of understanding that connects this creature, found a ring in the Gladden fields, to this ring is the One Ring. The connection required the kind of thinking that moves from data to meaning, from facts to significance, from the specific observation to the universal implication. Gandalf could make this connection because Gandalf thought in terms of persons and stories, in terms of the specific quality of narrative understanding that says this creature's story is connected to the larger story in a way that changes what the larger story means. The specific quality of thinking that the system thinker's analytical mode cannot replicate, because the system thinker sees systems and the narrative thinker sees stories. The ring was identified through story thinking. Through the specific act of understanding Gollum's personal narrative and recognizing its connection to the history of the ring. Through the kind of intelligence that Saruman did not possess and did not value. Part 16c. The psychology of self-deception. The deepest question about Saruman's corruption is this. Did he know? Did Saruman know that he had been corrupted? Did he recognize at any point in the 2,000-year process that his judgment was compromised, that his conclusions were being shaped by his private agenda, that the being he was becoming was not the being he had been sent to be? The answer is complicated, and the complication is the most psychologically precise aspect of Tolkien's characterization. Saruman knew and did not know simultaneously. He knew at some level that his pursuit of the ring was not part of the mission. He concealed the pursuit from the council. He lied about the ring's status, told the council it was in the sea when he believed it was still findable. The concealment and the lying demonstrate awareness. If he truly believed his actions were legitimate, there would be no reason to hide them. But the knowledge was not the kind that produces change. It was the knowledge that the corrupted intelligence handles through rationalization, through the specific quality of mental gymnastics that converts "I know this is wrong" into "I know this seems wrong, but is actually right," because the situation is more complex than other people understand. The rationalization was powered by the very intelligence that should have prevented it. Saruman's analytical capability was turned inward, applied to the specific problem of making his own corruption look like wisdom. The intelligence that could analyze any system in the external world was now analyzing the internal system of his own moral reasoning, and the analysis, conducted by the same intelligence that was producing the corruption, consistently concluded that the corruption was justified. This is the specific, precise, terrifying quality of intelligent self-deception. The smarter you are, the better you are at deceiving yourself. Because the intelligence that constructs the deception is the same intelligence that evaluates the deception. And the evaluator cannot objectively assess the work of the constructor when the evaluator and the constructor are the same being. Gandalf was protected from this because Gandalf did not trust his own intelligence. Gandalf's humility, his specific, constant, habitually maintained distrust of his own conclusions, was the circuit breaker that prevented the self-deception loop. Gandalf was always asking, "Am I right?" He was always checking against other people's perspectives. He was always open to the possibility that his own assessment was wrong. Saruman never asked. The voice which had been redirecting other people's conclusions for 2,000 years had, at some point, begun redirecting its own conclusions. The one-way channel of persuasion which had always pointed outward had turned inward, and the being who could convince anyone of anything had finally convinced himself. The self-deception is the corruption's innermost mechanism. The ring search, the Palantir contacts, the Wormtongue operation, the Uruk-hai, the industrial transformation of Isengard, all of these are external expressions. The self-deception is the internal engine, the thing that makes all the external expressions possible. The specific quality of a mind that has analyzed itself into a corner and cannot see the corner because the corner is inside the analysis. Part 17. Saruman's ring and the many colors. Saruman tried to make a ring. This is documented in the specific detail of the confrontation at Orthanc. When Gandalf arrives and Saruman reveals his hand, Saruman refers to himself not as the White, but as Saruman of many colors. His robes, which had been white, now shimmer with prismatic fragments, the white broken into its component colors, the unity fractured into multiplicity. Gandalf's response is immediate and devastating. "I liked white better." The exchange is about more than fashion. The white was the original designation, the color of the highest rank, the color that contains all other colors in unity. Saruman's many colors are the white analyzed and deconstructed, the unity taken apart, the whole reduced to its components, each component examined and understood and reassembled into something that is technically more complex but fundamentally less than what it was. This is the analytical intelligence's mode of understanding, applied to the intelligence's own identity. Saruman has done to himself what he did to Ring Law, what he did to Sauron's system through the Palantir, what he did to Thodon's court through Gurma. He has analyzed. He has taken apart. He has understood the components. And the understanding has not produced something greater. It has produced something lesser, because the white was not a system to be analyzed. The white was an identity to be inhabited. The white was the specific quality of being the leader of the Astari, a quality that was whole, unified, irreducible to components. When Saruman analyzed the white, he destroyed it. The understanding killed the thing it understood. Whether Saruman actually completed a ring of his own is not certain. The many colors designation suggests that he attempted the craft and produced something that was not the equal of the one, something that demonstrated understanding without matching power, something that was to the One Ring what a competent copy is to a masterwork. The failure is characteristic. The system thinker can analyze. The system thinker can understand. The system thinker can reverse engineer. But the system thinker's mode of making is derivative. It works from existing examples, from deconstructed principles, from the specific quality of understanding how it was done, rather than the specific quality of doing it yourself. Sauron made the One Ring through the direct application of his own spirit to the craft. The ring was original, the product of a Maya's concentrated will poured into matter. The making required not just understanding, but the personal, immediate, irreproducible act of creation that separates the artist from the analyst. Saruman's attempt was analysis masquerading as creation, the many colors masquerading as white, the copy masquerading as the original. Part 18. The Confrontation. Gandalf came to Orthanc in the summer of the year 3018. He came because he needed counsel. The ring had been identified. The situation was urgent. And despite his suspicions, despite his growing certainty that something was wrong with the head of the Order, Gandalf went to Saruman because the crisis was too large to navigate alone, and the White Wizard was still, nominally, the leader of the resistance. What Gandalf found at Orthanc was the completed corruption. Saruman's offer was framed with the voice's full capability. The pitch was calibrated with surgical precision, addressed to Gandalf's specific concerns and Gandalf's specific values, constructed to make the wrong thing sound like the wise thing. The old ways have failed, Saruman argued. Counsel and persuasion and the gentle cultivation of the free people's virtue, these methods, are insufficient for the scale of the threat. What the situation requires is power. Organized power. Systematic power. Power on the scale that Sauron has demonstrated is possible. We can wield that power wisely. We, the Istari, the wise, the beings who understand how the world works, can take the tools that Sauron has built and use them for better purposes. We can organize the free peoples not through domination, but through guidance. Not through fear, but through the specific quality of leadership that the free peoples need, but cannot produce for themselves. The ring is the key. If we find the ring, if we wield the ring, we can build the system that the free peoples need. We can coordinate the resistance. We can defeat Sauron. And then, with the ring's power and our wisdom, we can create the world that the world should be. Join me, Gandalf, together. The offer was not entirely wrong. Sauron was powerful. The old methods were under strain. The free peoples needed better coordination. The diagnosis of the problem was accurate. The prescription was catastrophic. Because the prescription required the Istari to become what the Istari were sent to prevent, a power that dominates rather than advises, a force that organizes from above rather than cultivating from within. Gandalf refused. The refusal is the hinge of the entire Third Age. If Gandalf had accepted, if the voice had found the right words, if Gandalf's own doubts and fears had provided the leverage the voice needed, the two most powerful Maiar in the West would have united around the project of organized domination. The ring, when found, would have been claimed by an alliance of two wizards, rather than carried to Mount Doom by a hobbit. The story would have ended in the specific, plausible, reasonable-sounding tyranny that Saruman had spent centuries building toward. Gandalf refused because Gandalf understood something that Saruman did not, something that the analytical intelligence could not compute, because it operated in a domain that the analytical intelligence could not see. Gandalf understood that the answer to Sauron was not a better system. It was faithfulness. The specific, humble, non-systematic, individual-level quality of doing what you can with what you have, trusting that something larger than your own capability is at work in the world. Saruman imprisoned Gandalf on the pinnacle of Orthanc. Not killed, imprisoned. Because even in the corruption, even in the completed treachery, Saruman could not bring himself to destroy the one person whose validation he most wanted. Killing Gandalf would have ended the possibility of Gandalf's agreement. Imprisoning Gandalf kept it alive. The resentment that had started 2,000 years ago in Valinor the Quiet contained professional resentment of the leader who knows that his followers prefer someone else, was, at its core, a need for recognition. And the imprisonment, among everything else it was the last desperate expression of that need. I will keep you here until you agree with me. Part 18b. What the imprisonment reveals. Gandalf was trapped on the pinnacle of Orthanc for approximately 2.5 months, from early July to mid-September of 3018. On the flat top of an indestructible tower, with no shelter, no food except what the wind brought, and no means of escape except the eagles that Radagast's birds would eventually summon. The imprisonment reveals something essential about Saruman's psychology, even in the completed corruption. Even with his hand fully revealed and his treachery in the open, Saruman could not bring himself to eliminate the one person who mattered most to him. Saruman did not kill Gandalf. The practical arguments for keeping Gandalf alive were weak. A captive wizard on a tower is a liability. The eagles could come, and did come. Gandalf's allies could learn of his imprisonment, and did learn. Every day Gandalf remained alive on that tower was a day the escape might happen, and a day the consequences of the escape might begin. Saruman was not foolish. He could calculate these risks. He chose to accept them. Not because the strategic calculation favored imprisonment over execution. Because the personal need, the need for Gandalf's validation, the need for the being everyone preferred to acknowledge that Saruman was right, was stronger than the strategic calculation. This is what the corruption looked like from the inside. A being whose analytical intelligence could compute every strategic variable in the western half of Middle-earth, making a decision that his own analysis identified as suboptimal, because the emotional need underneath the analysis was too powerful to override. The pride demanded Gandalf's agreement. The intelligence knew that keeping Gandalf alive was risky. The pride won. The pride always won. In the end, because the pride was the corruption's engine and the intelligence was the corruption's instrument. And the engine drives the instrument, not the other way around. Part 18c. The timeline of corruption. Let me lay out the chronology as precisely as the mythology allows, because seeing the full timeline makes the gradual quality of the corruption visible in a way that discussing individual events does not. Year Sec 1000, Kuramo arrives in Middle-earth as the leader of the Astari, genuinely committed to the mission. Travels east, studies Sauron's methods, returns with the diagnosis that the Free Peoples need organization. Years 1000-2000, Saruman operates in the west, provides genuine counsel, builds legitimate relationships with the Free Peoples leaders. The mission is working. The resentment of Gandalf is present but dormant. The Maker's desire is latent. Year 2463, the White Council is formed. Galadriel wants Gandalf. Saruman is chosen. The resentment activates. The ring lore study intensifies. The private agenda, the desire for the ring, begins to take shape. Years 2463-2759, Saruman leads the council. Delays action against Dol Guldur. Searches for the ring in the Gladden Fields. The corruption is present, but private. From outside, the White Wizard is still the White Wizard. Year 2759, Saruman settles in Isengard. Finds the Palantir. The Palantir contacts with Sauron begin. The gardens of Isengard begin to die. Years 2759-2941, the corruption deepens through the Palantir. The ring search continues. The industrial transformation of Isengard begins. The Wormtongue operation in Rohan is established. The relationship with the Dunlendings is developed. Year 2941. The White Council attacks Dol Guldur too late. Sauron retreats to Mordor. Bilbo finds the ring. Saruman does not yet know this. Year 2953. The last meeting of the White Council. Saruman tells the council the ring has been carried to the sea. Gandalf does not believe him. The last pretense of honest collaboration between Saruman and the council collapses. Years 2953-3000, the corruption accelerates. Isengard's transformation intensifies. The breeding of Uruk-hai begins. Saruman discovers that the ring has been found and deploys agents to locate it. The transition from hidden corruption to open preparation for war approaches. Year 3000, Saruman contacts Sauron directly through the Palantir. The double game begins. Saruman presents himself as a potential ally while secretly pursuing the ring for himself. Year 3018, Gandalf arrives at Orthanc. Saruman reveals his hand. Gandalf is imprisoned. The open phase of the war begins. 2,000 years, from arrival to open treachery. 2,000 years of the most intelligent being in the Astari Order gradually, systematically, decision by careful decision, transforming from the mission's leader into the mission's greatest enemy. The slowness is the horror, because a fall that takes 2,000 years is a fall that could have been stopped at any point along the way. At any year in those 2 millennia, Saruman could have chosen differently, could have stopped the ring search, could have shared his concerns with the council honestly, could have admitted to Gandalf that he felt the pull of ring law and needed help resisting it. He didn't. Not because stopping was impossible. Because each step on the path, taken individually, seemed reasonable. Because the intelligence doing the analysis was also the thing being corrupted, and a corrupted intelligence's assessment of its own corruption is by definition unreliable. Part 18d Saruman and Tolkien's Catholic theology. Tolkien was a devout Catholic. His theology operates in the deep structure of every story he tells, and in Saruman's story it operates with a precision that deserves specific attention. Saruman's fall is the fall of pride. Not pride in the casual sense of thinking highly of yourself. Pride in the theological sense that the Catholic tradition, specifically the Thomistic tradition that shaped Tolkien's thought, identifies as the root of all sin. The specific disposition of a will that has turned inward, away from the good it was created to serve, toward its own purposes. The Thomistic tradition says that pride is the root of all sin, not because pride is the worst sin in terms of consequences, but because pride is the sin that makes all other sins possible. Pride is the turning of the will away from its proper orientation toward God, toward service, toward the good of others, and toward itself. Once the will has turned inward, every subsequent choice is made from the wrong center from the self's purposes, rather than from the purposes the self was created to serve. Saruman's pride is the specific, sophisticated, almost invisible pride of the expert. The pride that says, I understand the situation better than anyone. My analysis is the most complete. My conclusions are therefore the most reliable. And if my conclusions differ from the conclusions of others, even from the conclusions of the beings who appointed me, my conclusions must prevail. This is not crude pride. It is not the pride of vanity or boasting. It is the pride of genuine excellence, the pride that is indistinguishable from confidence, because it is based on real capability. Saruman was the most intelligent. His analysis was the most sophisticated. His understanding was the most comprehensive. But the excellence was not the problem. The turning was the problem. The moment when I am the most capable became therefore I should direct, became therefore I should control, became therefore the constraints that prevent me from controlling are obstacles to the good, rather than features of it. The Astari mission was designed to prevent this turning. The Astari were sent in the bodies of old men, deliberately limited, specifically constrained, because the Valar understood that divine intelligence without constraint would produce precisely the pride-driven turning that they wanted to prevent. The constraints were not a design flaw. They were the mission's most important feature. Saruman accepted the constraints and then eroded them, not in a single act of rebellion. Through 1,000 small exceptions. Through the specific, incremental, always justified process of just this once, just in this case, just because the situation demands it. The constraints dissolved. And without the constraints, the intelligence operating at full capacity, without external check, without the specific friction that humility provides, ran itself off the road and into the ditch. Gandalf accepted the constraints and found freedom within them. Gandalf's mode of operation, the wandering, the counseling, the specific quality of working through other people rather than over them, was suited to the constraints. Gandalf did not chafe because Gandalf's nature was oriented towards service rather than control. The constraints felt natural because they matched what Gandalf wanted to do anyway. The difference between Gandalf and Saruman is the difference between a will that is oriented towards service and a will that is oriented toward control. Both are wills. Both are active. Both produce results. The difference is in the direction. And the direction toward service or toward control is the theological axis along which Tolkien's entire mythology is organized. Every story Tolkien tells is, at some level, a story about this axis. About the choice between serving the world as it is and remaking the world as you think it should be. About the difference between the gardener and the engineer, the steward and the master. The being who tends and the being who controls. Saruman chose control. Gandalf chose service. And the choice, that simple, binary, irreducible choice, determined everything. Part 19. What Saruman lost. When the war ended, when the Ents destroyed Isengard, when Gandalf broke the staff, when the voice was finally answered by voices that would not be redirected, Saruman lost everything he had built across 2,000 years. He lost the Council. The White Council, which he had led for centuries, which had been the framework of his authority and the instrument of his influence, gone. The alliance of the wise, dissolved around a leader who had betrayed its trust. He lost the army. The Uruk-hai, the soldiers he had designed and bred and armed. The military capability that was supposed to be the foundation of his competing system, destroyed at Helm's Deep and in the floods of Isengard. He lost the fortress. The Ents broke Isengard the way that waves break a seawall, with the patient accumulated force of nature responding to the violation of nature. The pits flooded, the forges drowned, the decades of industrial construction dissolved under the waters in hours. He lost the staff, the Astari's instrument of focused power, the specific tool through which a wizard channels and directs his divine capability, broken by Gandalf at the foot of Orthanc. The breaking was not violent. It was authoritative. The new White Wizard, speaking with the authority that the old White Wizard had forfeited, ended the old White Wizard's capacity for the focused exercise of supernatural power. He lost the rank. Saruman the White became nothing. The colour was given to Gandalf, the wizard Saruman had always resented, the being Galadriel had always preferred, the humble spirit who had been afraid, and whose fear had made him wise. Gandalf took the white because the white needed someone who could wear it without being consumed by it. But here is what Saruman lost that even the inventory of armies and fortresses and councils does not capture. He lost the respect of everyone who had ever respected him. For 2,000 years, Saruman had been the head of the Astari Order. The leaders of the Free Peoples, Elrond, Galadriel, the Lords of Gondor, the Kings of Rohan, had deferred to his judgment. They had trusted his analysis. They had accepted his leadership of the White Council, not because they were compelled, but because they genuinely believed he was the best qualified to lead it. And that belief, sustained across centuries of collaboration, was the foundation of everything Saruman had built. The betrayal did not merely end the collaboration. It retroactively poisoned every memory of it. Every piece of counsel Saruman had given across 2 millennia was now suspect. Every recommendation he had made to the council was now questioned. Had that been genuine advice, or had it been manipulation? Every delay he had advocated, the delays against Dol Guldur, the arguments for patience, the insistence that the ring was lost, all of it was reframed by the revelation of his treachery. What had seemed like wisdom was now visible as strategy. What had seemed like caution was now visible as sabotage. The leaders who had respected him did not merely stop respecting him. They felt the specific, personal humiliation of having been deceived by someone they had trusted. The respect turned to something worse than contempt. It turned to the shame of the deceived, the anger of the manipulated, the specific moral disgust that the betrayal of trust produces in those who gave the trust freely. Saruman had spent 2,000 years accumulating the most valuable currency in Middle-earth, the trust of the wise. And the betrayal spent it all in a single revelation, not gradually, the way it had been accumulated. Instantly, the trust of 2 millennia destroyed in the space of one confrontation. Part 19b. The stages of diminishment. The trajectory of Saruman's reduction from the White Wizard to Sharky of the Shire can be traced through specific stages, and each stage strips away one more layer of what he had been. The stripping is systematic. It is almost too precise to be coincidental, as if the world were methodically returning what the corruption had stolen, dismantling the corrupt structure layer by layer until nothing was left. Stage 1. The loss of the Council. The White Council dissolves around him. The alliance of the wise, which he had led for centuries, which had been the framework of his authority, gone. He is no longer the leader of the resistance. He is a wizard in a tower. Stage 2. The loss of the army. The Uruk-hai are destroyed at Helm's Deep and in the floods. The military force that was supposed to be the instrument of his competing system gone. He is no longer a military power. He is a wizard in a damaged tower. Stage 3. The loss of the fortress. The Ents break Isengard. The pits flood. The forges drown. The physical infrastructure of decades of construction gone. He is a wizard in a tower surrounded by wreckage. Stage 4. The loss of the staff. Gandalf breaks it. The Astari's instrument of focused power. The specific tool through which a wizard channels divine capability gone. He is an old man in a tower. Stage 5. The loss of the name. In the Shire he is Sharky, not Saruman, not Kurumu, not the White. A diminished name given by the ruffians who serve him. He is no longer even the old man in the tower. He is the petty dictator of a small community. Stage 6. The loss of the body. Wormtongue's knife, the spirit rising. The wind. Each stage removes the quality that was most recently acquired. The council was the last of the formal structures built around Saruman, and it is lost first. The army was built most recently, and it is lost next. The fortress follows. The staff follows. The name follows. The body follows. The stripping reveals that there was nothing underneath, no core of the original Kurumo preserved beneath the corruption, no kernel of the Maker Spirit that the corruption could not reach. The corruption had consumed everything, replacing each quality with its corrupted version, so that when the corrupted versions were removed, there was only smoke. This is the specific theological quality of total corruption, the replacement of the self by the corruption until the self and the corruption are indistinguishable. You cannot remove the corruption without removing the person, because the person has been converted into the corruption entirely. The wind from the west blows the smoke away, because there is nothing left that the wind could carry home. Part 19c. What the world lost. The cost of Saruman's corruption is usually measured in the things he did: the Uruk-hai, the Wormtongue operation, the scouring of the Shire, the delays at the White Council. These are real costs, real damage, real suffering produced by a being who should have been preventing suffering. But there is a larger cost that is harder to measure and harder to see: the things he did not do. The good that his extraordinary capabilities would have produced if they had been deployed for their intended purpose. Imagine Saruman on the right side. Imagine the system thinker's intelligence applied to the coordination of the Free People's defense. The analytical capability that built Isengard's industrial complex applied instead to the problem of organizing a multi-kingdom military alliance. The voice used not to manipulate but to unite, to help elves and dwarves and men overcome millennia of mutual suspicion and work together. Imagine the ring lore knowledge used not to search for the ring, but to help the council understand Sauron's strategy and counter it. Imagine the strategic acumen directed toward defense rather than domination. Imagine the intelligence that designed the Wormtongue operation, designing instead a communication network that linked the Free People's intelligence services into a unified surveillance system. Imagine the diplomatic work. The voice, applied legitimately, could have brokered agreements between kingdoms that had been suspicious of each other for centuries. Gondor and Rohan's alliance, which in the actual history was maintained despite Saruman's efforts to undermine it, could have been strengthened and expanded by Saruman's efforts to support it. The relationship between the Elvish kingdoms and the kingdoms of men, which was strained by millennia of divergent interests, could have been repaired by a mediator with Saruman's specific capability for understanding both perspectives and finding common ground. Imagine the military planning. The system thinker, applied to the specific problems of defending the Gap of Rohan, securing Gondor's borders, coordinating the elvish archers of Lurien with the cavalry of the Rohirrim with the infantry of Gondor, the result would have been a military capability that Sauron could not have overcome. The War of the Ring was nearly lost. The Free Peoples came within a hobbit's step of total defeat. The margin of victory was infinitesimal, the specific, providential, barely sufficient convergence of mercy and obsession at the crack of doom. If Saruman had been on the right side, the margin would not have been so narrow. The two greatest Maiar in Western Middle-earth, Saruman's analytical brilliance, combined with Gandalf's wisdom and compassion working together rather than against each other, would have been a force that Sauron could not have matched. Instead, one worked against the other. And the world got the War of the Ring instead of the alliance that might have been. This is the deepest cost of the corruption. Not the damage Saruman did, the good he did not do, the potential that was never realized, the alliance that was never built, the coordination that never happened, the defense that was never organized. 2,000 years of the most capable intelligence in the Astari Order, working for itself instead of for the world. The world paid for every one of those years. Part 20. The Scouring. The Scouring of the Shire is the final chapter, and it is the chapter that tells you what the corruption ultimately reduced him to. Saruman went to the Shire not to conquer anything strategically meaningful, not to build a new center of power, not to accomplish any purpose that his analytical intelligence could have defended as rational. He went to hurt it. The Shire was the most innocent place in Middle-earth. The hobbits, those small, decent, comfort-loving, food-appreciating, garden-tending people, had never threatened Saruman, had never been Saruman's enemy, had never done anything to Saruman except exist as the specific kind of people whose specific kind of goodness, the goodness of the gardener, the goodness of the neighbor, the goodness of the being who tends what is nearby rather than organizing what is far away, was the exact kind of goodness that Saruman's mode of intelligence could not perceive or value. And that was why Saruman went there. Because the Shire's goodness was an accusation. The Shire's beauty was a reproach. The specific quality of the Hobbit's life, the warmth, the community, the patient tending of gardens and friendships, and the ordinary business of ordinary existence, was an implicit judgment on everything Saruman had chosen. The Shire worked. Without systems. Without organization. Without a white wizard directing things from a tower. The Shire worked because its people were decent, and their decency was sufficient, and the fact that decency was sufficient was the thing that Saruman could not tolerate. He polluted the water. He cut down the trees. He replaced the mill with a smoky industrial operation that produced nothing useful. He made the Shire ugly. Not for strategic reasons, not for any reason that the analytical intelligence could have articulated. For the reason that belongs to the final stage of the corruption. The stage where the intelligence is gone and only the resentment remains. Saruman in the Shire is Saruman without the intelligence, without the system, without the grand strategy. Just the resentment, walking around in a broken wizard's body, breaking things, because breaking things is the only action left to a being who has lost everything else. He called himself Sharky. The ruffians who served him gave him the name. Not Saruman, not Karumo, not the White. Sharky, a diminished name for a diminished being. Wormtongue killed him. The servant turned on the master. A knife across the throat. In the doorway of Bag End, in the Shire, among the hobbits. The most reduced possible death for the being who had been among the greatest intelligences walking the earth. Part 20b. The voice of Saruman, the final test. Before the scouring, there is one more scene that shows you exactly what the voice was and why it was the most dangerous weapon in the mythology. The chapter Tolkien called The Voice of Saruman the confrontation at Orthanc after the Ents' assault. Saruman speaks from the balcony. He is defeated. His fortress is in ruins. His army is broken. He has nothing except the voice. And the voice still works. When Saruman speaks to Thodun's men, the men feel that perhaps the wizard has a point. Perhaps the war was a misunderstanding. The men who have just fought and bled and watched friends die because of this wizard's treachery begin to feel that the fighting may have been unnecessary. The almost working after everything that has happened tells you that the voice is more dangerous than the ring. The ring works through desire. The Nazgul work through fear. The armies work through force. All of these can be resisted by someone sufficiently brave. The voice works through the listener's own values. It takes what the good person already believes and uses those beliefs as the pathway to the wrong conclusion. You cannot resist the voice by being braver. You can only resist it by knowing you are being manipulated, and the voice's specific quality is that it makes the manipulation feel like your own thinking. Gimli resists first, not through argument. Through identification, the words of this wizard stand on their heads, the dwarvish stubbornness that recognizes when eloquence is being used as a weapon. Gandalf offers mercy, genuine mercy. Come down, renounce the corruption, rejoin us. Saruman refuses, because accepting would mean accepting that Gandalf is above him. The pride that has driven the 2,000-year corruption will not permit the acceptance of mercy from the being the pride has always resented. The staff breaks. The scene is the whole story compressed into one chapter. The voice, the resistance, the mercy, the refusal, the breaking. Everything Saruman was. But the specific quality of the mercy offer is what makes the scene devastating rather than merely climactic. Gandalf is not offering a deal. He is not negotiating terms. He is offering the one thing that could genuinely save Saruman, the chance to stop. The chance to step off the path. The chance to do, at the very end, What could have been done at any point during the 2,000 years to acknowledge the corruption and turn away from it? The offer is genuine. This is not a diplomatic ploy. Gandalf means it. If Saruman came down from the tower, if Saruman laid aside the corruption, if Saruman genuinely submitted to the correction that the offer represents, the road back would be open. Not easy, not quick, but open. Saruman sees this. He is intelligent enough to recognize a genuine offer when one is made. He understands what Gandalf is proposing. He understands that the offer is real, and the mercy is real, and the possibility of return is real. And he says no. Not because he disagrees with the analysis, not because he doubts the sincerity, because saying yes would require him to look at Gandalf and say, "You were right. I was wrong. You are above me now. Your way was better than mine." The words "you were right" are the words the pride cannot speak. 2,000 years of prideful corruption have made those three words impossible. They are the one combination of syllables that the voice which can say anything, which can persuade anyone, which can make any argument sound reasonable, cannot produce. Because "you were right" requires humility. And humility is the one quality the corruption has entirely consumed. The mercy was real. The refusal was real. And the distance between them, the distance between what was offered and what was rejected, is the final measure of what the corruption cost. Part 20c. What made the Shire specifically vulnerable? The Shire was vulnerable to Saruman's evil in a way it would not have been vulnerable to Sauron's evil. Sauron's mode of domination works through hierarchies, through command structures, through the top-down control that large organized societies are vulnerable to. The Shire has no hierarchy to commandeer. Sauron would have had no leverage. Saruman's mode works through commerce, through information, through the light touch, commercially embedded influence that enters a community through its economic connections and reshapes behavior from the inside. Lotho Sackville Baggins was the vector, not a spy, a hobbit businessman who wanted more than his share, and who found in Saruman's patronage the resources to accumulate economic power that the Shure's gentle traditions had no mechanism to resist. The Shure had never needed defenses against economic predation. The Hobbit's economy was organized around mutual sufficiency, each family producing what it needed and trading surplus with neighbors. The concept of someone buying up property to control rather than to use was foreign to the Shure's experience. Saruman's evil entered through the one gap in the Shure's defenses, the assumption that no one would exploit the Shure's gentleness. The assumption that centuries of peaceful experience had made seemed so reasonable that no hobbit thought to question it. The Scouring is the story of that assumption being violated, and the recovery the hobbits organizing, fighting back, replanting, is the story of the Shire's actual strength reasserting itself. The strength that was always there, but that had never been tested by this specific kind of evil. Part 20d. The Five Istari. The five responses to the same mission illuminate each other. Gandalf, humble effectiveness. The reluctant leader whose reluctance prevents the pride that destroys Saruman. Gandalf accomplishes the mission through the small things: Bilbo's pity, Frodo's faithfulness, Sam's love. The things no system can produce and no analysis can predict. Radagast, gentle abdication. The naturalist who withdraws from the political mission into the beauty of the natural world. Not corruption. Withdrawal, the failure that comes from loving the world too much and the mission too little. The Blue Wizards, the unknown. Their disappearance represents the specific uncertainty the mission always carried. Two divine intelligences swallowed by the vastness of the East. proof that the mission could fail silently and totally. Saruman, brilliant corruption, the leader who engages fully, whose every capability turns against the mission it was meant to serve. The worst-case scenario of total engagement without humility. Gandalf got the proportions right. Enough humility to prevent pride, enough courage to prevent withdrawal, enough engagement to do the work, enough restraint to prevent the work from consuming the worker. Saruman got every proportion wrong. Intelligence without humility. Engagement without restraint. Capability without wisdom. Every quality in excess, without the counterbalancing quality that would have kept the excess from becoming toxic. Part 22. The Garden's Answer. Sam Gamgee planted a malorn tree in the party field. He used the gift of Galadriel, the soil of Lorien, the seed of the golden trees that grew in the enchanted forest. He planted it in the hole where the party tree had stood before Saruman's ruffians cut it down. He tended it. He waited. The tree grew, golden-leaved, the only malorn in the Shire, the most beautiful tree in any garden in the world. The tree is the answer to Saruman, not the armies, not the Ents, not the breaking of the staff, the tree. The simple, specific, hobbit-quality act of putting a seed in the ground that someone else had spoiled and trusting it to grow. The gardener defeats the system thinker, not through superior intelligence, not through counter-system, through the specific, ancient, irreducible act of cultivation, the act that works with what is there, rather than imposing what you think should be there. The act that requires patience rather than power. The act that produces beauty rather than efficiency. Saruman could have planted trees. He had the knowledge. He had the capability. He had the intelligence to be the greatest gardener in the history of Middle-earth if he had applied his systematic understanding to the craft of growing things rather than the craft of destroying them. He chose the furnace over the garden, the forge over the field. The mode of making that requires raw materials to be consumed over the mode of making that requires living things to be tended. And the choice was the corruption, expressed in its simplest and most physical form, the preference for the dead over the living, the preference for the controllable over the free, the preference for the designed over the grown. The malorn tree is growing still. In the mythology's timeline, in the history that Tolkien imagined extending beyond the story's ending, the tree that Sam planted in the ruins of Saruman's destruction is growing. The most beautiful tree in the Shire, standing in the place where the ugliest act of Saruman's career was committed. Growing because a gardener planted it and the earth received it, and the beauty that cannot be systematized reasserted itself in the ground that the system thinker had spoiled. Part 23. Gandalf's fear and why it saved him. Gandalf was afraid of Sauron. He said so. In Valinor, when the mission was proposed, Olrin, who would become Gandalf, said he was too weak, too afraid. Manu said, "That is exactly why you should go." The fear was the asset, not the weakness. The asset, because the fear produced humility, and the humility produced wisdom, and the wisdom produced the specific quality of self-distrust that prevented Gandalf from making every mistake that Saruman made. Gandalf did not study ring lore deeply, not because he was incurious, because he was afraid of what the study might do to him. Gandalf did not use the Palantir, not because he lacked the capability, because he was afraid of what the seeing might do to his judgment. Gandalf did not seek power, not because he was indifferent to outcomes, because he was afraid of what power would do to his character. Every fear-driven refusal was a refusal to enter the specific domain where the corruption operated. The fear kept Gandalf out of the trap. The fear was the wall between Gandalf and Saruman's fate. Saruman was not afraid. Saruman was confident, and the confidence led him into every domain that the fear kept Gandalf out of. The ring lore, the Palantir, the pursuit of power, the construction of the competing system. Every step taken with confidence. Every step wrong. The lesson is not be afraid. The lesson is know what you cannot safely handle. The wise person's fear is not the coward's fear. It is not the fear of danger in general. It is the specific fear of the specific danger that the wise person knows they are specifically vulnerable to. Gandalf knew his vulnerability. He knew that the same divine capability that made him useful also made him dangerous. He knew that the power he carried could destroy the world as easily as it could save it. And the knowing the specific, honest, unflinching acknowledgement of his own potential for harm was the thing that kept the potential from being realized. Saruman did not know his vulnerability, or knew it and dismissed it, or knew it and was too proud to accept that it applied to him. The gap between Gandalf's self-knowledge and Saruman's self-ignorance is the gap between the wind from the west that blows smoke away and the ship from the grey havens that carries the faithful home. Part 25. The specific tragedy of the expert. Saruman's story is Tolkien's meditation on what we might call the tragedy of expertise. Not the tragedy of ignorance. Ignorance does not have the capability to produce the scale of damage that Saruman inflicted. Not the tragedy of evil. Evil is already where it is going. The tragedy of expertise. The specific quality of being very good at something, of understanding a domain deeply, of having the acknowledged authority that comes from genuine capability. That quality, turned in the wrong direction, is what Saruman's story shows. Tolkien lived through 2 world wars. He saw what expertise could produce. The atomic bomb was the product of the most sophisticated physics expertise in history. The totalitarian systems of the century were designed and maintained by genuinely brilliant organizers. The propaganda machines that drove nations to destruction were operated by genuinely talented communicators. The lesson of the century was not that intelligence is bad. It was that intelligence without wisdom is catastrophic. The capability to do without the wisdom to know what should be done produces outcomes that are efficient and devastating simultaneously. Saruman is the mythology's incarnation of this lesson. The most intelligent being in the Astari order is also the one whose intelligence, redirected from its purpose, produces the most damage. The correlation is not coincidental. The intelligence is the damage. The very capability that makes Saruman the most qualified leader is the capability that makes him the most effective traitor. The world needs intelligence. Tolkien was not arguing against the maker's impulse or the system thinker's analytical capability. He was arguing that intelligence without moral wisdom is the most dangerous combination available, because the intelligence provides the capability and the absence of wisdom provides the misdirection. Saruman had the capability. He lacked the wisdom. The world paid. And the world keeps paying, because the tragedy of expertise is not a one-time event, it is a recurring pattern. Every generation produces its Sarumans, not evil beings, not malicious actors. Brilliant, capable, analytically rigorous people who understand systems with extraordinary precision, and who apply that understanding in service of purposes they have chosen for themselves, rather than purposes that serve the world they live in. The pattern is always the same. The expertise is genuine. The capability is real. The contribution, initially, is valuable. And then the specific quality of being the best at something begins its work, the slow, invisible transformation of I understand this domain better than anyone into I should control this domain into this domain exists to serve my understanding of it. The transformation is invisible from inside because the intelligence doing the transforming is the same intelligence doing the monitoring. The fox is guarding the henhouse. The instrument of analysis is also the thing being analyzed. And a corrupted instrument, analyzing its own corruption, will always return the result, no corruption detected. Gandalf avoided this trap. Not through superior intelligence, Saruman's intelligence may genuinely have been greater. Through superior self-knowledge, through the specific, humble, terrified acknowledgement that the intelligence capable of saving the world was equally capable of destroying it, and that the only reliable protection against the destroying was the constant, active, never complacent awareness that the destroying was possible. Part 26. The architecture of pride. At the foundation of everything underneath the system's intelligence, the ring law, the palantir, the voice, the Uruk-hai, the Wormtongue operation is pride. The specific theological fault that Tolkien's Catholic tradition identifies as the root of all other faults. Not the crude pride of vanity or boasting. The sophisticated pride of the expert who trusts his own judgment above all others. The logic of this pride runs like this: I was chosen by the Valar as the best available leader for the most important mission in the world. If the Valar chose me as the best, then my judgment must be the most reliable. If my judgment is the most reliable, then my conclusions must be the most accurate. If my conclusions are the most accurate, then anyone who disagrees with me must be wrong. If they are wrong, and I am right, then the appropriate response to disagreement is not reconsideration, but overruling. If overruling is appropriate, then the system should be organized to facilitate my conclusions rather than to accommodate others' objections. If the system should facilitate my conclusions, then the system needs me at its center, with the authority to direct outcomes without the friction of consensus. If the system needs me at its center with that authority, then the constraints that prevent me from exercising that authority are obstacles to the mission rather than features of it. If the constraints are obstacles, then removing them serves the mission, and if removing the constraints serves the mission, then I should rule. Step by step, conclusion by conclusion, each step reasonable, each conclusion defensible, and the endpoint, the end of the logic that starts with I was chosen because I am the best, is tyranny. Saruman followed this logic to its conclusion. Gandalf refused to enter the logic at all, and the difference between following and refusing is the difference between smoke and ships. Part 27. What Tolkien was saying. Tolkien was a devout Catholic who watched the 20th century happen. He watched the brightest minds of his era build weapons that could end civilization. He watched the most organized societies of his time organize genocide. He watched the most sophisticated communicators of his generation communicate their nations into madness. Saruman is the mythology's response to what Tolkien saw. Not the response of despair. Tolkien's mythology is fundamentally hopeful. The response of diagnosis. The identification of the specific mechanism by which good qualities become instruments of evil. The mapping of the specific path from I understand the problem better than anyone to I should be in charge to the world exists to serve my vision. The mapping is precise. The path is traceable, and the tracing reveals that the path is not inevitable, that at every point along the way, a different choice was available. That the pride which drove the corruption was not a force of nature, but a choice, a series of choices, made by a being with full consciousness and full capability. Each choice narrowing the range of subsequent choices until the range narrowed to a point, and the point was tyranny. The story is a warning, not a prophecy, not a condemnation, a warning addressed to every intelligence that has ever felt the specific seductive pull of I know best, the pull that feels like wisdom and is pride, the pull that feels like service and is domination, the pull that feels like the reasonable response to a complex situation and is the specific, sophisticated, analytically rigorous abandonment of the humility that the situation actually requires. The warning is, your intelligence is not your goodness. Understanding how things work is not the same as understanding what things are for. The capability to organize is not the authority to rule. And the confidence that you are the best, even if the confidence is justified, even if you are the best, is the specific, precise, exactly calibrated danger that will destroy you if you mistake it for wisdom. Gandalf knew this. Gandalf was afraid. Saruman did not know this. Saruman was confident. The fear saved the world. The confidence nearly ended it. Part 28. The final image. Here is the image I want to leave you with. Two wizards. Same mission. Same divine origin. Same fundamental capability. One becomes the wind-blown smoke of a broken spirit rejected by the home that sent it. The other sails west from the grey havens with the ring-bearers, carried home on a ship made by the elves, returning to Valinor as the mission intended. The difference between them is not capability, not intelligence, not even fundamentally moral fibre. The difference is this: one of them knew what he was for. The other only knew what he was good at. Gandalf knew what the Astari were for. They were for helping, for counselling, for the specific, humble, undramatic work of walking among mortals and understanding their struggles and offering, when asked, the perspective of a being who sees more than mortal eyes can see. The Astari were for the small things, the pity of a hobbit in a cave, the faithfulness of a gardener on a mountain, the love of a friend who will not leave. Saruman knew what the Astari were good at. Strategy, analysis, organization, the comprehensive, systematic, intellectually elegant management of complex situations. The specific quality of high-level thinking that produces plans and structures and the machinery of coordinated action. What the Astari were for and what the Astari were good at were not the same thing. And the wizard who knew what he was for accomplished the mission. And the wizard who only knew what he was good at destroyed it. That is what Saruman was doing before the war began. He was forgetting what he was for. Slowly, brilliantly, over 2,000 years of the most intelligent corruption in the history of Middle-earth. Forgetting that the purpose was not to organize, but to help. Not to build systems, but to tend people. Not to make the world work better, but to serve the world as it was. He forgot what he was for. And the forgetting accumulated across 2 millennia of increasingly sophisticated misdirection, produced the broken wizard in the Shire, and the knife, and the smoke, and the wind. And the garden grew anyway. Sam planted the seed. The earth received it. The golden tree rose from the ground that Saruman had spoiled. The garden always grows. The system always fails. Because the garden works with what is, and the system works against it. That is the teaching. That is the story. That is what Saruman was doing before the war began, and what the war's ending says about what he should have been doing instead. Stay with us. The tower goes deeper than the foundation, and we are not done looking yet.